Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to step into the smoky back rooms of New York in the 1970s, where loyalty was currency, respect was survival, and one careless joke could get you killed. This is the story of William "Billy Bats" Bentvena, a man who lived by the old code of honor and died because he believed it still mattered. To his friends, he was a loyal Gambino soldier. To his enemies, he was a reminder of a world that no longer played by the same rules. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? We love seeing this underworld of ours stretch across cities, continents, and time zones. And if you enjoy sinking into the real stories behind Goodfellas, The Godfather, and the men who inspired them, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a night in the shadows. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the day drift away, and follow us into a world where silence could mean power or death. This is Outlaw Icons. Your Sleepy Dawn. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Smile. The bar was thick with smoke, the kind that blurred faces and truths alike. Glasses clinked, laughter bounced off the walls, and in the corner of that haze sat a man with a grin that could cut through the fog. William "Billy Bats" Bentvena. His smile wasn't loud or forced. It was the kind that belonged to a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, and somehow still believed he was untouchable. That night, no one knew it yet, but behind that grin hid a secret ending already in motion. The kind of ending that only the streets of New York could write, with blood, silence, and a lesson about when to keep your mouth shut. Long before that grin became infamous, long before the name Billy Bats echoed through FBI reports and mob whispers, there was just a kid from Brooklyn. The year was 1921. The country was staggering out of the Great War and stumbling toward the Great Depression. In the narrow, brick-lined alleys of Little Italy, the air smelled of bread, sweat, and ambition. Boys played stickball between parked cars while old men argued about Mussolini on stoops. Mothers leaned from windows, yelling in Sicilian, and every street corner seemed to have its own set of rules. Unwritten, unbreakable, and enforced by men who didn't need badges. Billy grew up watching those men. They wore suits even on hot days. Their shoes shined brighter than the sun, and people moved aside when they walked past. To a boy in worn-out shoes, they looked like kings. But the kind of kings who didn't need castles. Only respect. That was the currency of those streets. Respect. It could buy safety, loyalty, even forgiveness. And Billy learned early that a smile could earn it faster than a threat. His father was a quiet man who worked long hours at the docks, the kind who measured success by survival. His mother prayed every night that her son would never end up like the men who haunted the corners after dark. But in neighborhoods like that, the line between right and wrong was as thin as cigarette smoke. You either worked for a living or you worked for the family, and one of them paid better. Billy was a fast learner. By his teenage years, he was running errands for bookmakers, collecting small debts, learning how to talk to people, not just with words, but with tone, posture, and timing. He had what the old-timers called presenza, presence. By the time Prohibition ended, Billy had already found his calling. The neighborhood was crawling with opportunity and danger. The gangs that once fought over beer routes now fought over bars, gambling dens, and loan shark money. Billy didn't fight his way up. He smiled his way in. That was his weapon, charm. Where others used fists, he used persuasion. He had a way of making you feel like he was doing you a favor, even when you were the one paying him back. By the late 1940s, the Mafia had evolved. No longer a cluster of street punks. It had become an empire with rules, rituals, and a hierarchy as strict as any corporation. And Billy, smooth, loyal, and low-key, caught the eye of the Gambino crew. He wasn't flashy like some of the young guns that came later. He believed in quiet power. In a world full of noise, silence was a sign of control. And he had it. The post-war years made men hungry. New York was booming, the docks were alive, and the mob had its hands in every shipment, every contract, every vice. Billy moved up as a dependable earner. He didn't boast about his money or his connections. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who he was connected to, and that was enough. He became a made man in the Gambino family, one of the most respected and feared organizations in America. To outsiders, made man was just another mob term, but in their world, it was sacred. It meant untouchable. It meant that the family itself had baptized you in blood and oath. Killing a made man without permission was like setting fire to your own church. It guaranteed your destruction. Billy understood that better than anyone. It wasn't just about power. It was about identity. He didn't work for the mob. He was the mob. Through the 50s and 60s, Billy earned quietly. No headlines, no arrests, just steady money and respect. He had bars in Brooklyn, investments in construction, and whispers said he had a piece of several nightclubs. When he entered a room, men stood up, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement, that subtle, silent language of hierarchy that only the underworld understands. Yet, for all his charm, there was something unreadable in his eyes, like he was always listening for trouble. The world outside was changing. The 60s brought civil rights marches, rock music, and rebellion. But in the backrooms of Brooklyn, time stood still. Billy lived in that stillness, a world where loyalty mattered more than love, and silence could be a man's loudest defense. He didn't brag, didn't argue, didn't overplay his hand. That's why they called him Bats. Not because he was loud or violent, but because he could strike without warning. Quick, clean, decisive. But beneath that polished surface, there was a restlessness he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was age catching up. Maybe it was the sense that the world was shifting under his feet. The new generation of gangsters didn't respect the old ways. They were flashier, greedier, more reckless. The code he'd lived by, patience, respect, and order, was slowly being replaced by cocaine, chaos, and ego. Billy's last big mistake wasn't a job, or a betrayal, or a deal gone wrong. It was believing he could come back to that world after prison and pick up where he left off. But in the underworld, time doesn't forgive. When he went away in the mid-60s for a narcotics charge, he did his time without complaint. He kept his mouth shut, the ultimate proof of loyalty. In prison, that silence earned him respect. When he came out, though, he expected the same world waiting for him. He was wrong. The young guys running the streets now, men like Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke, didn't see him as a mentor. They saw him as a relic, the kind of old-school wise guy who still believed in rules. And in a world that was rapidly losing them, that kind of man could be dangerous. Not because he'd kill you, but because he'd remind others how things used to be. Before all that, though, before the fateful night and the insult that would echo through mob history, there was just Billy, a man who loved a good suit, a stiff drink, and a quiet corner. He was the kind of guy who'd walk into a bar and make everyone feel like they'd known him for years. He listened more than he talked. He'd nod at your stories, laugh at your jokes, and somehow, without ever raising his voice, command the room. That was his power, not fear, presence. Some nights, he'd drive alone through the streets of Brooklyn, the city lights flickering off the windshield. He'd pass the docks where his father once worked, the stoops where old men still played cards, the bars that now belonged to younger men with louder mouths. Maybe he wondered when everything changed. Maybe he thought about walking away. But men like Billy didn't retire. They faded, until the world forced them out. The neighborhood still remembered him as one of the good ones, a man who'd shake your hand before he hurt you, who believed in fairness, at least by mob standards. But even the good ones had ghosts. And Billy's ghosts were starting to whisper again. Old debts, old grudges, and new enemies waiting in the dark. It said that the most dangerous kind of man is the one who mistakes nostalgia for safety. Billy's smile was both armor and illusion, a mask that told the world he was still in control, even as the ground shifted beneath him. Behind that calm expression was a growing sense of unease, a recognition that the streets he once ruled by charm now belonged to a generation that didn't care who you were, only what you could offer. He wasn't naive. He knew time changes everything, but he believed respect was timeless. That was his mistake. In the Mafia, respect is only as good as the men left to honor it. And the men who replaced him weren't built for loyalty. They were built for chaos. The last time anyone saw Billy truly at peace was during those months right after his release. Friends and family threw him a party. Old faces showed up, glasses were raised, and for a moment, it felt like the old days again. He was smiling, laughing, telling stories about prison, the kind of stories that make men seem invincible. But under the laughter, there was a shadow in his eyes. Maybe he sensed it, that his story was nearing its final act. The city outside didn't care. It was moving too fast. Nightclubs throbbed with disco and powder. Young gangsters were burning money faster than they could count it. The balance that once held the underworld together was unraveling. The codes, the rules, the respect, all of it fading into noise. And in that noise, a man like Billy, old school, calm, disciplined, stood out, too visible in his silence. In another life, he might have walked away. He might have opened a small bar somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the ghosts of Brooklyn. But the thing about men like Billy is that the streets never really let them go. Once you've lived by that code, it's tattooed on your soul. You stop being a man, you become a reputation. And reputations don't retire. They get buried. By the end of 1969, Billy was back in the mix. Not to make trouble, just to reclaim what was his. The respect, the connections, the rhythm of the life. To him, it wasn't greed. It was identity. He'd done his time, paid his dues, and now he wanted back in. But the younger guys saw something different. An old lion walking back into a jungle that had forgotten him. Somewhere in those smoky bars and whispered deals, his fate began to write itself. All it would take was one night, one party, one careless remark, to turn that easy smile into the last thing anyone would ever remember about him. Billy Batts had lived his life by a simple truth. Keep your word, keep your calm, and keep your smile. But in a world where words were weapons and smiles could be mistaken for weakness, that truth was about to betray him. And so, as the music of the 70s began to hum through the bars of Queens, Billy, freshly free, freshly hopeful, walked back into the world that had once crowned him a king. Only this time, the throne had new rules, and the men around him had shorter tempers. Somewhere in that smoke, a young man named Tommy was waiting, full of ambition, full of rage, and carrying a memory he'd never let go. Billy didn't know it yet, but the next time his smile filled a room, it would light the fuse to one of the most infamous killings in Mafia history. The streets were changing, the loyalties shifting, and the clock quietly ticking toward midnight. Billy Batts had returned to the life he loved, but the life no longer loved him back. And soon, that smile would vanish forever. Chapter 2. Climbing the Ranks. In the smoky dawn of post-war New York, when men in fedoras walked faster than the truth, Billy Batts began to rise. The city was alive again, pulsing with money, music, and quiet deals made in backrooms that smelled of cigars and sweat. The war had ended, the soldiers had come home, and the streets were filled with men chasing their version of the American dream. For some, it was a factory job. For others, like Billy, it was control, not through force, but through respect. The kind you didn't demand. The kind you made people offer willingly. He wasn't a man who needed to shout to be heard. In a world full of noise, his silence spoke louder than most men's threats. He understood that the real power in the Mafia wasn't in who had the loudest gun, but in who had the calmest hands. And Billy's hands were steady. He learned quickly that the most dangerous man in a room was never the one who yelled. It was the one who smiled, waited, and watched. By the late 1940s, New York's 5 families had become institutions. The Mafia wasn't some secret gang anymore. It was a shadow government, woven into the city's very heartbeat. Construction, shipping, nightclubs, unions. Every deal passed through a dozen invisible hands before it ever touched the law. And in that invisible empire, Billy was learning to navigate. He knew when to talk, when to listen, and when to let silence do the work. That skill made him invaluable. He started small, running errands for the Gambino family's Brooklyn crews. It was never about money at first. It was about trust. You didn't get promoted for being smart. You got promoted for being reliable. If you said you'd deliver an envelope by dawn, it better be there by dawn, even if you had to walk through fire. Billy understood that. Every errand, every handshake, every late-night conversation was a brick in the quiet wall he was building around his reputation. By the early 50s, he had carved out his own little piece of the city. Bookmaking, shylocking, protection, the kind of rackets that didn't make headlines, but made men rich. And he handled them with surgical precision. While other young mobsters boasted about money, cars, and women, Billy stayed measured. He dressed well, spoke less, and kept his business clean. That's what made him stand out. When you looked at him, you didn't see a thug. You saw a man who could walk into a boardroom or a bar and fit in both. That duality was rare, and the old bosses noticed. Carlo Gambino himself ran the family like a silent orchestra. He despised chaos. He preferred whispers over gunshots. And Billy was the perfect note in that symphony. They said Gambino trusted him because he never overplayed his hand. He didn't chase power. He attracted it. Naturally, almost unwillingly. You could tell he loved the life, but you couldn't tell it from his face. No arrogance, no greed. Just quiet confidence, the kind that made weaker men nervous. In those days, New York was divided into invisible borders. Each family controlled its slice, and each slice was guarded by men who believed those lines were sacred. Billy handled the Brooklyn slice for his crew, a mix of gambling and union rackets. He worked with efficiency, no wasted motion, no unnecessary blood. If someone missed a payment, Billy didn't need to break their legs. He'd sit them down, buy them a drink, and make them realize, politely, that paying him was in their best interest. It was manipulation disguised as hospitality, and it worked. He wasn't a saint. He'd hurt people when he had to, but unlike many others, he took no joy in it. Violence, to Billy, was a tool, not a language. He used it sparingly, almost reluctantly, and that made it more effective. When Billy Bats threatened you, it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was calm, matter-of-fact, like someone explaining the weather. That tone made men listen, because it carried truth. Through the 50s, his reputation spread. They called him Bats because he could disappear into the dark and strike when least expected. He never swung wildly. He waited for the right pitch. It was a nickname born from precision, not rage. The kind of precision that only came from patience, something few gangsters had. Outside the world of the Mafia, America was changing. The suburbs were rising, television was reshaping dreams, and families were moving away from the neighborhoods that once birthed the underworld. But Billy stayed. The streets of Brooklyn weren't just his territory. They were his identity. Every brick, every bar, every whispered deal had his fingerprints on it. He didn't see the Mafia as a criminal enterprise. He saw it as a system, an order that kept chaos out of the streets. He believed, truly, that the Mafia was a kind of balance. Crooked, yes, but balanced. At night, he'd sit in dimly lit bars with men who would one day be legends. Men like Tony Ducks Corallo, Neil Delacroix, and a young John Gotti, still learning the ropes. They talked about business like priests talked about scripture, and Billy listened more than he spoke. He was the kind of man who absorbed everything: patterns, power shifts, emotions. He could read a room faster than most men could read a menu. But even as he climbed the ranks, he never lost that charm that made him likable. Waitresses adored him. Cops tolerated him. Politicians trusted him. He had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of something bigger, even when he was the one pulling the strings. His smile was his weapon, and it cut deeper than any blade. In the mid-50s, the mob was at its height. The Commission, the secret council of bosses, had solidified its control. Murder Incorporated was a story of the past, and a new generation was running things with suits instead of bullets. Billy fit perfectly into this era. He wasn't the kind of gangster who wanted to make headlines. He wanted longevity. He wanted respect that outlived the noise. There's an old saying in the Mafia: a man's reputation walks into the room before he does. For Billy, that reputation was gold. He was known as steady, fair, and, most importantly, predictable. You always knew where you stood with him. That kind of reliability was rare in a world built on betrayal. It made him invaluable. But there's a price for being the calm one in a world of fire. When you don't scream, people start to assume you don't feel. When you don't overreact, they think you're weak. And as the 60s approached, a new kind of gangster began to rise. Louder, flashier, greedier. Men like Tommy DeSimone, born in a different time, raised in chaos, not codes. They didn't understand men like Billy. To them, quiet didn't mean control. It meant old, outdated, replaceable. Still, during the early 60s, Billy's influence peaked. He was earning big for the family, gambling, loan sharking, small pieces of legitimate businesses that gave his income the appearance of respectability. He'd become a trusted ear for higher-ups, often smoothing over disputes between crews before they turned violent. He had that rare ability to calm men with a few words. But the streets were becoming restless. Drugs were flooding in, and the old guard hated it. They believed narcotics brought too much heat, too many rats, too many graves. Billy agreed, but the money was too good, and some men couldn't resist the pull. That's what got him caught. A narcotics charge in the mid-60s landed him in prison. It wasn't a long sentence by mob standards, less than 10 years. But for a man like Billy, it was eternity. Time moved differently behind bars. Every week felt like a month. Every rumor from the outside world sounded like a storm he couldn't see, but could feel coming. Yet even in prison, he carried himself like a man in control. Other inmates respected him. He didn't gamble, didn't brag, didn't complain. He read books, wrote letters, and waited. They said he once broke up a fight between two inmates without raising his voice, just stood between them and stared until both men backed down. That was Billy. He didn't need to prove he was dangerous. Everyone already knew. When he was finally released in 1970, the city had changed again. The old restaurants were gone, the neighborhoods rougher, the mob younger and wilder. Billy walked through Brooklyn like a ghost returning to his old haunt. The same streets, the same bars, but different faces, different rules. The men who now ran things didn't remember who he was, and the few who did treated him like a story from another era. It was a strange feeling, being both respected and forgotten. He still had the charm, still had the presence, but he could feel it, the unspoken judgment from the younger wise guys. They didn't care that he'd done time without flipping. They didn't care that he'd earned for Gambino. They cared that he was old school. And in a world that now worshiped chaos, old school was the wrong religion. He started spending his nights at Robert's Lounge, a bar owned by Jimmy Burke, a man who made his fortune through robbery, hustling, and charm of his own. Jimmy was smart, dangerous, and unpredictable, the kind of man Billy both respected and distrusted. He could sense the shift and energy around him. The air was thicker, the conversations quicker, the laughter more forced. The young men were restless, looking for validation through violence. They didn't want peace. They wanted stories. Billy didn't mind being underestimated. He'd build a career out of letting people think they were in control. But there was one thing he couldn't stomach: disrespect. For him, respect wasn't just a word. It was oxygen. Take it away, and a man suffocated. That belief, once his strength, would soon become the fuse to his downfall. Every time he walked into Robert's Lounge, he carried the weight of two worlds, the past he represented and the future that didn't want him. Yet he never flinched. He'd shake hands, buy drinks, tell jokes, even laugh with the men who'd one day plan his death. Maybe he believed his old reputation would protect him. Maybe he thought that being a made man still meant something. But the Mafia, he returned to no longer play by those rules. There's a kind of tragedy that only happens when a man doesn't realize he's living in a world that's already moved on. Billy was proud, loyal, and blind to the fact that the code he lived by was already crumbling. The young guys didn't care about Gambino's ways or quiet power. They cared about making a name. And in a cruel twist of irony, Billy's quiet confidence, the thing that once made him powerful, made him a target. He'd survived decades in a world where one wrong word could end her life. But soon, it wouldn't be his silence that killed him. It would be his voice. A single sentence, meant as a harmless joke, would cut deeper than any blade. For now, though, Billy was still smiling, still walking the line between nostalgia and denial. He believed that respect was eternal, that men like him could never truly fade. But as the nightclubs thumped with new music, as cocaine replaced loyalty, and as ambition began to outweigh honor, that belief was becoming a death wish. The city that once crowned him was no longer his. The faces were new, the rules rewritten, the balance broken. Billy Batts had climbed the ranks with charm, patience, and silence. But soon, he'd learned that the higher you climb in the underworld, the harder the fall. And sometimes, it only takes one laugh, one look, one wrong word to send you plummeting into the dark. And somewhere out there, a young man named Tommy was already remembering an old insult, replaying it in his head, waiting for the perfect moment to answer back. Chapter 3. The Gambino Era. The nights in New York during the 1950s had a pulse of their own, dim lights glowing against rain-soaked pavement, laughter spilling out of corner bars, and the quiet shuffle of men who carried secrets in their pockets. It was a city built on rhythm and risk, and for Billy Batts, that rhythm was his heartbeat. He had climbed from the rough concrete of Brooklyn's Little Italy into the polished darkness of the Gambino family's inner circle, and he wore that invisible crown with quiet pride. The city was changing fast, but so was he. Every move was a calculation, every smile a mask, every handshake another thread in the web that bound New York's criminal empire together. By the time the 50s were in full swing, the Gambino family had become a quiet powerhouse, disciplined, profitable, and patient. They didn't make headlines, they made money. Where other families relied on violence, Carlo Gambino relied on intelligence. He built his empire the way a chess master builds a game, with strategy, silence, and sacrifice. And among his many soldiers and capos, Billy Batts was one of the few who truly understood that philosophy. He didn't crave attention or chaos. He craved longevity. He wanted to survive, not as a ghost, but as a name whispered with respect in the right rooms. Billy's job wasn't glamorous. He wasn't robbing banks or running guns. His role was quieter, more refined, the kind of work that built real power. He managed gambling rackets and oversaw loan-sharking operations across Brooklyn and parts of Queens. To outsiders, it seemed small, but those rackets were arteries of the Mafia's financial system, pumping cash into bigger ventures, construction, shipping, and city contracts. Every dollar Billy collected strengthened the family's hold on the city, and in return, he earned something money couldn't buy: trust. Carlo Gambino liked men who didn't draw attention. Men who didn't drink too much, didn't talk too loud, didn't start trouble they couldn't finish. Billy fit the mold perfectly. He was the kind of man who could sit through an entire meeting without saying a word, then summarize every person's weakness afterward. He understood that the Mafia wasn't built on blood. It was built on psychology. You didn't need to pull a trigger to kill a man. Sometimes all it took was a look, a pause, or a single whispered rumor. By the late 50s, the Gambino family had infiltrated nearly every major labor union in New York. Dock workers, truckers, construction foremen, they all answered, one way or another, to men who answered Carlo. And Billy was one of the conduits that made that chain unbreakable. He handled collections with precision. No one ever saw him lose his temper, but everyone knew not to test him. There was a saying in the bars back then: if Bat smiled at you, it meant he liked you. If he stopped smiling, start running. He ran his operations like a business, punctual, organized, efficient. He kept ledgers in his head, remembered debts by faces, and never needed to write anything down. He dressed sharply but not loudly, spoke respectfully even to men he despised, and had an uncanny ability to make everyone feel seen. That charm made him indispensable. Even cops who suspected him liked him. He'd buy them drinks, joke about the weather, and never once give them anything to hold on to. He wasn't just untouchable, he was uncatchable. But behind every calm man in the Mafia is a storm he keeps hidden. Billy's was his pride. He'd spent years building a reputation as one of the few men who could balance loyalty with self-respect. He wasn't a yes man, and that made him both valuable and dangerous. Gambino liked him, but other captains envied him. In a world where every favor came with a price, Billy's confidence sometimes looked like defiance. That tension simmered quietly in the background, never spoken, but always felt. He had friends in every family. He played cards with Lucchese men, drank wine with the Genovese, and even exchanged polite nods with the Colombos. That kind of cross-family diplomacy was rare, and it made him a bridge, but bridges are always the first things to break when the ground shakes. He knew that too, but he never showed fear. To him, fear was like blood in the water. Show it once, and the sharks never stopped circling. By the 1960s, New York was changing. The skyline rose higher, the music got louder, and the streets got meaner. The Mafia was no longer hiding. It was thriving in plain sight. Billy had transitioned from a street soldier to a man of influence. He had money, he had respect, and he had a name that carried weight in the bars, restaurants, and social clubs of Brooklyn. But something in the air was shifting. The new generation of mobsters, younger, hungrier, less patient, was starting to emerge. They wanted fast money, fast power, and fast fame. Men like Billy, who preached patience and discipline, were starting to look like relics. Still, in those early years of the decade, he was untouchable. He had weathered police crackdowns, FBI investigations, and internal rivalries that had buried other men. He was, in many ways, the model of what a made man should be: loyal to his boss, generous to his friends, and merciless to his enemies. But no man rises in the Mafia without leaving footprints on someone's neck, and Billy's quiet climb had created resentment in places he couldn't see. He spent most of his nights at the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, a dim, smoke-filled room where laughter always had an echo of menace. The regulars respected him. They'd pour him a drink before he even asked, move aside when he walked past, and always listen when he spoke. But there was one thing they noticed. Billy never bragged about his past. He never told war stories or recounted close calls. When men asked him about his early days, he'd just smile and say, "If I told you everything, you wouldn't believe half of it." It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. In a world where everyone wanted to be a legend, Billy preferred to be a rumor, and that made him powerful. Legends get remembered, but rumors never die. He had a small crew of his own, loyal men who handled the day-to-day work. They weren't killers, not primarily. They were earners, gamblers, collectors, fixers. The kind of men who knew how to make money without leaving corpses behind. Billy taught them to think before they swung. To him, a good gangster was like a chess player, always 3 moves ahead, never too proud to sacrifice a pawn if it meant saving the king. That philosophy made his crew efficient, calm, and profitable, but also made them targets. Other crews resented how easily Billy ran things. He never had to yell. He never had to prove himself. Power seemed to follow him naturally. And in the Mafia, natural power is the most dangerous kind, because it can't be taken, only destroyed. There were whispers that even the bosses envied him, not for his money, but for his calm, for the way he could sit through chaos and never lose his composure. When others panicked, Billy stayed centered. Some men called that strength. Others called it arrogance. Either way, it drew attention, the kind that could kill. He knew better than to trust anyone completely. In his world, friendship was just a slower form of business. Every drink shared, every favor granted, every laugh traded came with an invisible ledger. You might not see the debt that day, but one day, someone would collect. Billy never forgot that. He treated every alliance like a loaded gun, useful, but dangerous to hold for too long. At home, he was surprisingly ordinary. A neat apartment, a few tailored suits, family pictures tucked away in drawers rather than displayed. He didn't flaunt his wealth. He didn't throw parties. He lived like a man who knew the value of invisibility. But invisibility comes with loneliness. There were nights when he'd sit by the window, watching the city lights flicker, wondering if the peace he'd built was real or just a temporary illusion. For all his control, he couldn't control time. The world was changing faster than even he could adapt to. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the rise of the counterculture, they all chipped away at the old order. The Mafia's hold on the city was still strong, but the ground beneath it was shifting. The new generation wasn't raised on respect and silence. They were raised on greed and impulse, and that was something Billy couldn't negotiate with. Still, he tried. He became a quiet mentor to younger men in the family, teaching them how to keep their tempers, how to handle police pressure, how to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Some listened. Most didn't. They saw his calm as weakness, his patience as fear. They didn't understand that the real secret of survival in the Mafia wasn't ruthlessness. It was restraint. Billy tried to warn them. But warnings don't work in a world built on pride. He was making more money than ever, but he could feel it, that creeping sense of instability. The kind that starts with whispers and ends with gunfire. The old bosses were aging. The young ones were restless. And in between stood men like Billy, too young to retire, too old to change. In 1964, everything shifted. The FBI cracked down harder on organized crime. Wiretaps, informants, surveillance. The invisible world was becoming visible. The old system of silence, the sacred omerta, was being tested. And it was in that chaos that Billy made a rare mistake. A deal involving narcotics. A line the old bosses considered forbidden. Whether it was greed, trust, or simple bad luck, the deal went bad, and Billy was caught in the fallout. He was sentenced to time in federal prison. For a made man, prison was both punishment and test. Most men broke under the pressure. Billy didn't. He kept his composure, his silence, his dignity. Other inmates looked up to him. He was the same man inside that he'd been outside. Calm, measured, deliberate. But time has a way of changing the world while standing still for those who wait. By the time his sentence ended, the streets that had once bowed to him no longer remembered his name. He returned to a different New York, one buzzing with new money, new faces, and new rules. The Gambino family was still strong, but its tone had changed. Violence was back in fashion. Respect was currency no one bothered to carry anymore. Billy tried to re-enter quietly, to rebuild what he'd lost, but he was no longer part of the rhythm. The music had changed, and he was dancing to a song no one else could hear. Still, he didn't fade easily. He was determined to reclaim his place, not out of ego, but out of identity. The Mafia wasn't just what he did. It was who he was. And men like Billy didn't walk away. They simply stepped back into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reappear. That moment would come one night in Queens, under dim bar lights and cheap liquor. A party thrown in his honor. A welcome home for a man who had once ruled in silence. He'd laugh, he'd drink, he'd shake hands with men who smiled too wide. And somewhere in that crowd, a young gangster named Tommy DeSimone would be watching him, remembering old wounds, old jokes, and the kind of disrespect that never really fades. Billy Batts had survived the streets, the bosses, and the law. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the deadliest threat wasn't coming from rivals or cops. It was sitting just a few seats away, dressed in friendship, sipping whiskey, and waiting for the right moment to turn laughter into blood. The Gambino era had made him, but it would also, quietly, begin to unmake him. And for the man who built his empire on silence, it was only fitting that his end would begin, not with a gunshot, but with a single, fateful joke. Chapter 4. Prison Time and Silence. The clang of steel on steel was the sound of time itself, inside Lewisburg Penitentiary. Every door that shut echoed through a man's chest like a warning, a reminder that freedom was just an idea now, something that existed for other people. For William Billy Batts, Bentvena, it wasn't his first time seeing the inside of a cell, but it was the first time it truly felt permanent. The outside world had stopped moving for him the day they closed that gate. And as the days bled into months and the months into years, the silence that once made him powerful began to turn into something else: isolation. But if there was one thing Billy understood better than anyone, it was that silence, even in prison, could be a weapon. When he first arrived, The guards treated him like they treated every other mobster, with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. They'd seen plenty of tough guys come through those walls, most of them loud, brash, and broken after a few months. But Billy wasn't like them. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't boast about who he knew. He kept his hands in his pockets and his head down. Within days, the other inmates began to notice the calm around him. There was something unsettling about a man who didn't need to announce his presence, who could walk through a yard full of killers and never once be tested. He had that quiet gravity that made the air shift when he passed. Prison, to Billy, was just another kind of street, different walls, same rules. Power belonged to those who understood timing. He spent his first months studying the place like a map, learning who controlled what, who to trust, who to avoid, and who to ignore completely. Every favor, every conversation, every glance carried weight. And while other inmates traded cigarettes or secrets, Billy traded respect. He knew that once you earned it, you didn't have to ask for it again. He was in for narcotics, a crime that didn't sit well with the old-school bosses. The Mafia's code had long forbidden drugs. They saw it as messy business, the kind that brought heat and ruined men's loyalty. Billy hadn't been a dealer. He'd simply been connected to the wrong deal at the wrong time, his name tied to an operation he never fully controlled. But in their world, guilt didn't need proof, just proximity. So when the gavel came down, he didn't argue. He took it like a soldier. He didn't point fingers, didn't cut deals, didn't open his mouth. That silence, that unwavering adherence to the old code, saved his reputation. In the yard, word spread quickly. The Gambinos had a man inside who didn't talk. And in prison, that meant everything. You could be feared, you could be respected, but the men who stayed silent were rare, and they were worshipped. Within a year, Billy had become one of those quiet legends, a man who could settle disputes without ever raising his voice. The guards noticed it too. They'd see two inmates on the verge of a fight, only for Billy to step between them, a calm hand raised, eyes level, and within seconds the fire would die out. It wasn't authority that stopped them. It was presence. He didn't run a crew inside. He didn't need to. His influence moved through the place like smoke, unseen but everywhere. He'd share his commissary with men who had nothing, help others write letters home, and listen to confessions no priest would ever hear. It wasn't charity. It was control through kindness. In the Mafia, there are two kinds of power, the kind that's feared and the kind that's respected. Billy always preferred the latter. But even the calmest man feels the cracks of time. At night, when the lights went out and the echo of distant laughter faded, he'd lie on his cot staring at the ceiling, replaying his life like an old movie reel. The noise of the city, the bars, the laughter, the easy money, all gone. In their place were footsteps, whispers, and the metallic rhythm of keys against concrete. He would think of Brooklyn, of his mother's prayers, of the streets that had both raised him and betrayed him. Regret wasn't a luxury he allowed himself often, but in those quiet hours, it crept in. He wasn't young anymore. His hair, once slick and dark, was turning gray. His hands, once steady, were starting to show their age. But the thing that hurt most wasn't the passing of time. It was irrelevance. The world outside was still moving, changing, evolving, and he wasn't part of it. He didn't know the new names, the new faces, the new rules. The Mafia he'd left behind was not the one he'd return to. He'd hear whispers from other inmates about the streets, about rising young hotheads, about how the old codes were being broken daily. Cocaine was flooding in, respect was thinning out, and loyalty was just another currency. He would listen and nod, but never comment. Inside, though, he knew the thing he'd spent his whole life believing in was starting to decay. Every so often, he'd receive a letter. A cousin, an old friend, a former associate careful not to say too much. The letters were polite, coded, meaningless in the grand scheme. But to Billy, they were oxygen, proof that the outside world hadn't completely forgotten him. He'd write back carefully, never mentioning names, always speaking in metaphors. The garden still grows, he'd write, or the river still flows clean. Anyone who read it would think he was writing poetry. But those who knew him knew what it meant. The business was still alive, and when he got out, so would he. Prison taught him patience in a way the streets never could. Out there, decisions were fast. You lived by instinct, by gut, by adrenaline. In here, time moved like molasses. Every action was deliberate, every word measured. It honed him, turned him from a street philosopher into something colder, a strategist. He stopped dreaming of freedom and started planning for it. He knew his time would come, and when it did, he wanted to walk out not as a broken man, but as a made man reborn. There was one guard, a young Irish kid named Connor, who treated Billy with respect. The kind of respect that didn't come from fear, but from fascination. He'd linger by his cell, asking questions about life, about power, about what it really meant to be part of the Mafia. Billy would give him half-truths wrapped in lessons. Power, he'd say, isn't about what you take. It's about what you can afford to leave on the table. The kid would nod, write it down later maybe, not realizing he was collecting pieces of a dying philosophy. Sometimes, when the yard was quiet, Billy would sit alone on the benches and listen to the wind. It sounded different behind bars, emptier, like it carried secrets no one could quite hear. He'd close his eyes and imagine the city, the hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, the muffled laughter from bars. He missed it all, but not because of the money or the power. He missed it because it made him feel alive. Out there, even danger had rhythm. In here, everything was still. He saw men lose themselves in that stillness. Strong men, proud men, reduced to ghosts pacing the same 10 steps every day until they forgot why they were angry. Billy refused to be one of them. He had discipline, a fortress built inside his mind. Every morning, he'd wake up early, press his uniform, polish his shoes, and make his bed with military precision. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control. The world could take his freedom, but it couldn't take his routine. Years passed. The faces around him changed, but he remained constant. Even the guards began to treat him differently. They'd greet him politely, ask for his opinion on disputes, sometimes even consult him when they needed to understand the dynamics between inmates. He had become something like an elder statesman in a world that wasn't supposed to have statesmen. When news came that Carlo Gambino himself had passed away, Billy sat alone in his cell, staring at the letter that carried the news. The man who had shaped his world, the quiet Don who ruled with whispers, was gone. In his place now stood Paul Castellano, a businessman more than a boss. Billy didn't judge him, but he understood what that meant. The old way was gone for good. The Mafia was turning into something else, something colder, greedier, more fragile. He folded the letter neatly, slid it into the pages of a book, and didn't speak for 3 days. His release came quietly. No grand send-off, no fanfare. One morning, they just called his name, handed him his clothes, and opened the gate. He stepped out into the sunlight like a man waking from a long dream. The world felt louder. The air smelled different. He took his first breath as a free man and realized he was breathing in an entirely new era. The city he returned to wasn't the city he'd left behind. The cars looked different. The music blaring from passing windows was alien. Even the streets seemed to hum with a new kind of chaos. Brooklyn, once filled with familiar faces and codes, was now crowded with strangers and noise. The Mafia was still there, but it was louder, brasher, less disciplined. The men running the rackets didn't wear suits anymore. They wore leather jackets and sunglasses, talking about money like it was oxygen. The respect that once ruled the streets had been replaced by arrogance. Billy didn't fit in, but he didn't panic. He adapted, the way he always had. He sought out old friends, men who still remembered what it meant to conduct business with dignity. They welcomed him back politely, but he could feel it, the distance. He was an echo from another time, a ghost dressed in yesterday's manners. The young wise guys tolerated him, smiled at his stories, but their eyes wandered when he spoke. They didn't care about codes or principles. They cared about quick money and notoriety. Still, he was back, and that alone felt like victory. He bought new suits, walked the same streets he once owned, and stopped by the same bars where his name still meant something. People shook his hand. Old-timers clapped his back. For a moment, he let himself believe he could rebuild, that there was still room in this new world for a man like him. But deep down, he knew time had moved on without him. He'd spent nearly a decade in silence, and the world had learned to talk louder in his absence. The Gambino family was changing, its alliances shifting, its leaders growing paranoid. The men who now called the shots didn't remember the old days. They didn't remember what it meant to bleed for loyalty. And yet, for all that, Billy still carried himself like the man he had always been, calm, proud, and quietly dangerous. He believed respect could still win over chaos. That belief would be his undoing, because somewhere in that city, young blood was watching him. Men who'd grown up in a world without patience. Men who saw his restraint not as strength, but as weakness. They didn't care that he'd done his time in silence, that he'd never ratted, never begged. To them, he was just another old man trying to reclaim a throne that no longer existed. Still, Billy smiled. He had survived prison, and in his mind, that meant he could survive anything. But the streets didn't work like that anymore. The new rules didn't honor old legends. The men who had once whispered his name in respect would soon whisper it again, but this time as a warning. He didn't know it yet, but his silence, the same silence that had once made him powerful, that had carried him through prison and earned him respect, was about to become his curse. The quiet man who had built his life on composure was about to walk into a world where quiet wasn't strength anymore. It was target practice, and as he stood outside that bar one cold night in Queens, shaking hands with faces he didn't fully trust, the wind carried a chill that wasn't just weather. It was a warning. The world had changed. The players had changed. But Billy Batts, the man of silence, of patience, of principle, hadn't. He couldn't hear it yet, but fate was already whispering his name, softly, like a joke waiting to be told. Chapter 5. The world changed while he was away. The city he came back to didn't recognize him anymore. When Billy Batts stepped out of prison in 1970, the New York skyline had grown taller, meaner, and louder. The old stoops where kids once played stickball were gone, replaced by junk cars and fading posters that flapped in the wind like forgotten promises. The neighborhoods that had once smelled of bread and cigar smoke now carried the bitter scent of exhaust and cocaine. The mob was still there, but it had new rules, new faces, and new sins. Billy had walked out of a cell, expecting to return to the same world he'd left behind, a world of respect, hierarchy, and codes. What he found instead was a new generation that had traded loyalty for speed, patience for greed, and silence for noise. He was older now, but he carried himself like he always did, with that same quiet confidence that could fill a room without a sound. The younger guys didn't know what to make of him. They'd heard the name Billy Batts in old stories told by older men, but to them, he was a ghost from a black and white world. They didn't understand what it meant to be made when being made actually meant something. They didn't remember when you had to earn every inch of respect, not just buy it with fear. The streets didn't run on tradition anymore. They ran on impulse. And in a city where everyone was shouting, a man who spoke softly might as well have been invisible. Billy spent his first few weeks back reacquainting himself with the rhythm of the city. The sound of passing cars felt faster. The bars were louder, the laughter emptier. He'd stop in at the old social clubs, some still around, most gone, and see new faces where old ones had once sat. Many he used to call friends were either dead, in hiding, or serving sentences longer than life itself. The ones who remained looked at him with that awkward mix of nostalgia and distance. They respected him, sure, but they spoke to him like you speak to a relic. Something valuable, but from another time. The Gambino family was still strong, but different. Carlo Gambino was still the boss, but the structure beneath him had shifted. Younger captains had risen, hungrier than ever. Some were sharp, calculating, and dangerous in the old way. Others were reckless, chasing quick money and faster glory. They weren't patient men like Billy. They didn't build. They consumed. He could feel it in every conversation. That subtle impatience, the need to prove themselves through violence or flash. It made him uneasy. The Mafia had always been about control, about moving slowly enough to never be seen until it was too late. But now it felt like everyone was running at full speed, eyes shut, chasing something that couldn't last. Billy found himself spending more time in Queens than Brooklyn. The old neighborhoods had lost their soul, but Queens still had that buzz of opportunity. Bars, rackets, gambling rooms, and men with connections. That's where he met Jimmy Burke again. Jimmy was Irish, but he was as much a gangster as any made man. Smart, charming, dangerous, the kind of man you wanted on your side and feared on your bad day. They'd known each other before Billy went away, and Jimmy greeted him like an old friend. Smiles, drinks, and easy talk. But there was always something behind Jimmy's grin, a calculation. Billy respected him, but he didn't trust him completely. Still, in a world where familiar faces were few, even half-trust felt like gold. It was through Jimmy that Billy met a new crowd, the young wolves running wild under the Lucchese banner. Henry Hill, with that easy smirk and restless energy. Tommy DeSimone, hot-tempered and volatile, with eyes that never seemed to settle on one thing for too long. They weren't like the men Billy grew up around. They were quick to laugh, quick to fight, and even quicker to forget what loyalty meant. But they had one thing Billy admired: ambition. It reminded him of himself once, before the years and the cells had slowed his pulse. At first, they treated him with respect. He was a made man. After all, something they could never be, no matter how much money or blood they spilled. When Billy walked into a room, they stood up. When he spoke, they listened. But underneath that surface politeness, he could feel something else. Impatience, mockery, maybe even fear. The young ones didn't like being reminded that there was a world before them, a time when power wasn't loud, when killers wore suits, not sneakers. Billy didn't care. He wasn't there to compete with them. He just wanted back what was his. The streets he'd helped shape, the respect he'd earned, the piece of the action that had once been his livelihood. He wasn't greedy. He didn't need to be the biggest earner, the toughest guy, or the loudest in the room. He just wanted his seat back at the table, the one he'd left behind when he went to prison. But the problem was simple. In the mob, no one saves you a seat. If you leave it empty too long, someone else sits down, and they don't get up without a fight. He started small, easing his way back in through old connections. Some bookmakers still remembered him, still trusted him. He kept things quiet, running small loans, helping collect debts, taking his cut without making waves. But even small waves can ripple far, and soon word spread that Billy Batts was back on the street. The old-timers smiled when they heard it. The younger ones rolled their eyes. Some said he was trying to reclaim the past. Others said he was too smart to be dangerous anymore. But one man, one young, unpredictable man, heard it differently: Tommy DeSimone. Tommy was barely in his mid-20s, all fire and fury stuffed into a small frame. He'd grown up idolizing gangsters like Billy, but resented them too. To him, men like Batts were reminders of everything the younger generation was trying to escape: patience, restraint, rules. Tommy didn't want to wait his turn. He wanted to be feared now. And nothing made him angrier than being reminded that he was still just a kid in the eyes of the old guard. The tension between them started small. Harmless jokes, subtle power plays, little moments where the old world brushed against the new. Billy didn't even notice it at first. He'd been around long enough to know that young men barked before they bit. He figured Tommy's temper was just bluster. But Jimmy Burke knew better. Jimmy had an instinct for people, and he could feel the friction growing. Still, he did nothing. Maybe he thought it would blow over. Maybe he thought it would be entertaining to watch. Or maybe, deep down, he liked having that tension around. It reminded him how fragile peace really was. Billy started spending more evenings at Jimmy's bar, Robert's Lounge. It was the kind of place where men went to drink, laugh, and pretend they were untouchable. The jukebox was always playing Sinatra or the Stones. The whiskey never ran out, and every corner of that room had a secret. To Billy, it felt familiar, almost comforting, a place where he could blend in with the noise and forget how much the world had changed. But every time he walked through those doors, he was walking into a minefield he couldn't see. The younger guys respected him, but not enough. To them, he was old news. They laughed a little too hard at his stories, nodded a little too fast when he spoke. The respect fell hollow, like a performance. Still, Billy smiled through it. He'd survived worse than arrogance. He believed time would straighten him out. But the truth was, time was running out for him too. The difference between the world he left and the one he returned to could be summed up in a single word: noise. The old Mafia had been quiet. Deals were whispered, killings were clean, respect was measured in silence. Now everything was loud. The music, the money, the violence. The streets didn't just hum with tension, they screamed with it. Men didn't hide their crimes anymore. They bragged about them. The cops were smarter, the FBI hungrier, but the gangsters didn't care. They thought the rules didn't apply. Billy knew better, but no one was asking for wisdom. He noticed something else too: fear. Not the kind that used to keep men disciplined, but the kind that made them paranoid. Everyone was watching everyone. Everyone suspected betrayal. Informants were popping up like weeds, and trust had become an endangered species. Billy had done his time the right way, silent, loyal, unbroken. But in this new world, that loyalty didn't mean what it used to. To the young ones, it was just an old story, a myth they could nod to without believing. Still, Billy tried to keep his balance. He told himself that the core of the life hadn't changed, that beneath all the chaos and cocaine, the code still mattered. He told himself that if he just stayed calm, stayed disciplined, the respect would come back naturally. But deep down, he could feel it, the undertow pulling him toward something darker. He didn't belong in this version of the Mafia. He was too composed for a world that thrived on chaos, too honorable for a generation that mistook fear for respect. There were nights when he'd walk home from Robert's lounge alone, his coat collar turned up against the wind, and think about how the streets looked different under the lamplight. The faces were younger. The laughter was sharper. The rules were gone. He'd think about the men he came up with, the ones who believed in hierarchy, who would have died rather than disrespect a made man. And he'd realize, painfully, that those men were either buried or forgotten. He was walking through the ruins of his own kingdom. And yet, despite the unease, despite the warning signs he could almost feel in his bones, Billy didn't pull away. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was habit. Maybe he simply couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't part of it. He'd lived too long by the code to ever abandon it, even if the code no longer existed. He told himself he was just getting back in a rhythm, that the young ones would come around eventually. But they weren't going to, because to them, he wasn't part of their rhythm. He was a ghost dancing to a song they'd stopped playing years ago. One night, Jimmy invited him to a party, a welcome home of sorts. Billy didn't think much of it. He'd been to 100 parties like that before. Drinks, laughter, a few stories swapped between men who pretended to like each other. But this one would be different. The air would be thicker. The smiles would be sharper. The laughter would hide something colder beneath it. It would be the night the old world and the new collided, one final time, under the dim lights of Robert's lounge. But that night hadn't come yet. For now, Billy was still walking those streets, still convincing himself that he could bridge the gap between the past and the present, still believing that the world could make room for a man who believed in respect over rage. He didn't realize that in this new age, respect didn't buy you safety anymore. It bought you enemies. The world had moved on. The rules had changed. And the man who once mastered silence was about to learn that silence, in the wrong decade, was just another way to be forgotten, or worse, remembered for the last sound you ever make. Chapter 6. Welcome home, Billy. The night was warm, humid, and humming with the restless energy of a city that never really sleeps. June in Queens always had that heavy air, part gasoline, part beer, part electricity. Robert's lounge sat on the corner like a secret that didn't bother pretending anymore. It wasn't fancy, just another neighborhood bar with cheap whiskey, sticky floors, and laughter that came too easily. But on this night, the laughter was genuine. Billy Batts was home. He'd been out of prison only a short while, But in the eyes of the old-timers, it felt like the return of a legend. The man who kept his mouth shut. The man who didn't break. The man who went in with pride and came out with silence. To the few who still believed in the old code, that made him something sacred. And for Billy, this night was supposed to be a celebration, a reunion of sorts. But beneath the smiles, the handshakes, the clinking glasses, something colder was moving in the air. Something he couldn't yet see. The jukebox was playing old Sinatra tunes, the kind that made men sentimental about things they could never really talk about. The bar smelled like spilled beer and cigarette smoke, and the walls seemed to tremble from the noise of conversation. Everyone was there. Jimmy Burke, always dressed sharp but never flashy, holding court with that half-smile that meant he was watching everything. Henry Hill, floating from group to group, restless and half-drunk, his eyes darting like a man who never quite trusted peace. And then there was Tommy DeSimone, young, restless, burning from the inside out. He walked with that jittery confidence that came from never being told no. His laughter was loud, his temper louder. When Billy walked in, the room shifted. Heads turned. The old faces smiled, the new ones studied. He looked good for his age, sharp suit, pressed collar, a touch of gray at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. His eyes were calm, warm even, but they carried something behind them, the weight of years lost and the quiet pride of a man who'd survived them. He went around the room like a man revisiting memories, shaking hands, hugging old friends, patting backs. He laughed, genuinely, not because he had to, but because it felt good to be back in a world that at least pretended to remember him. Jimmy greeted him like a brother. "You look good, Billy. They must have treated you right in there," he said, pouring him a drink. Billy chuckled, took a sip, and replied softly, "Only because I didn't give them a reason not to." It was a line that made the old-timer smile, a reminder that the code still meant something to some men. For a moment, everything felt right, like the years had melted away. The music, the voices, the easy rhythm of laughter. It was all familiar, comforting. But not everyone in the room shared that warmth. Tommy sat at the end of the bar, half listening, half waiting. He had a look that didn't fit the night, a kind of restless anger that didn't belong in celebration. Maybe it was jealousy. Maybe it was the ghost of something older. Billy had known Tommy when he was just a kid, shining shoes, running errands for older wise guys. Back then, Tommy was all nervous energy and wide eyes, desperate to be noticed. Billy had been one of the men who did notice him, though not in the way Tommy liked to remember. There was a story that Billy, one night years ago, had teased him about those shoe-shining days. A harmless joke in the old world, where teasing was a sign of familiarity. But to Tommy, it was a scar. The night wore on. The music got louder, the drink stronger. Billy was in his element, telling stories, trading jokes, buying rounds. Every word he said carried that old-school charm, that effortless authority that came from having lived it all. The younger guys laughed, even if they didn't fully get the stories. But Tommy didn't laugh. Not once. He sat there, staring, his fingers tapping the counter like a ticking clock. At one point, Billy caught his eye. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe it was nostalgia, maybe it was just the old instinct to bring a man into the circle. He walked over, smiling, and clapped a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Tommy, look at you," he said, loud enough for a few nearby to hear. "All grown up. You were just a kid the last time I saw you. What are you now, 25? 26? You look good. You still shining shoes. Or did they finally let you use your hands for something else?" The room laughed. Not cruelly, not even sharply. It was just an old joke, a callback to a simpler time when words didn't have to mean war. But for Tommy, it wasn't a joke. His face froze for half a second before he forced a grin, the kind of grin that doesn't reach the eyes. Jimmy noticed it. Henry noticed it. But Billy didn't. He wasn't looking for trouble. He thought the line would break the ice, not light a match. He moved on, kept talking, kept smiling. He didn't know he'd just signed his own death sentence with one sentence. Tommy sat still, the laughter ringing in his ears like an insult that wouldn't fade. He looked at Jimmy, who gave him a look that said nothing but meant everything. "Not here," not now. But Tommy's pride was louder than reason. He'd spent years clawing his way up from errand boy to killer, from nobody to somebody. And now this man, this relic from another time, had reminded him of who he used to be. It wasn't about Billy anymore. It was about Tommy's reflection, about the kid he thought he'd buried. The humiliation burned. Billy didn't notice the tension. He was laughing again, talking about the old days, about how the business used to run on respect and patience. Tommy's name didn't cross his mind again that night. But for Tommy, the moment never ended. It kept replaying, louder and sharper each time. Every word Billy said after that sounded like an echo of that one line. Go shine your shoes. It wasn't just a joke now. It was a challenge. And Tommy DeSimone was the kind of man who never walked away from a challenge. As the night wound down, the crowd thinned. The jukebox switched from Sinatra to silence. Jimmy, Henry, and Tommy lingered behind, pretending to help close up. Billy stayed too, sipping what he said would be his last drink. He was happy, content even. The world outside still felt strange, but for the first time in years, he felt like himself again. He thanked Jimmy for the party, raised his glass, and toasted old friends. It's good to be back, he said with that smile that always carried more power than volume. Feels like I never left. Jimmy smiled too, though it didn't reach his eyes. Henry shifted nervously, sensing something unspoken hanging in the air. And Tommy just stared, that grin still plastered on his face like a crack in glass. What happened next has been told 100 different ways. Some say it happened fast, a blur of movement and rage. Others say there was a pause, a moment of eerie quiet before the storm. But everyone agrees on one thing. It started with a sound, the sudden thud of glass hitting wood, the scrape of a chair, and then Tommy's voice cutting through the air. Now go get your F*** and shine box. The room froze. Billy looked up, confused at first, then amused. What's that supposed to mean? He said, still smiling, thinking maybe Tommy was just breaking his chops back. But Tommy wasn't smiling anymore. He was standing now, eyes wild, fists clenched. The air felt heavier. Henry's stomach dropped. Jimmy didn't move. The silence stretched, thin and dangerous. Billy shook his head, raised his hands in a small gesture of peace. Relax, kid. It's just a joke. We're all having a good time. He turned to sit back down, and that's when it happened. Tommy snapped. He moved fast, faster than anyone in the room could react. The first punch landed square on Billy's jaw, the sound sharp and wet. The second one came before the first could even echo. Then the third. Jimmy jumped in, not to stop it, but to join it. Henry watched, frozen, as years of respect, history, and silence were beaten out of Billy Bats in seconds. The laughter, the music, the night, it all evaporated. There was only the sound of fists, the dull thud of bodies hitting the floor, and Tommy's voice, low and shaking with fury. You think you could talk to me like that? You think you're still somebody? Billy tried to fight back, but there was no room for words. The blows kept coming until his face was barely recognizable, his blood mixing with the spilled whiskey on the floor. He wasn't dead yet, but he was close. When it was over, Tommy stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. Jimmy looked down on the body, his expression unreadable. Henry stood in the doorway, pale, shaking, not quite believing what he'd just seen. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Jimmy broke it first. We gotta move him, he said quietly. His tone wasn't panicked, just cold, practical, like he'd said those words before. Tommy nodded, wiping his hands on his shirt. Yeah, he muttered. Let's get him out of here. They wrapped Billy's body in a tablecloth, dragging him across the floor. His blood left streaks behind that the mop could never really erase. Outside, the night was still. The city didn't care. Cars passed. Dogs barked. Sirens wailed somewhere far away. Just another night in New York. They loaded him into the trunk of Henry's car. Jimmy lit a cigarette, his hands steady. Henry's were not. He glanced back at the trunk, half expecting to see the lid move. He's dead, right? He asked. Tommy looked at him, eyes wild and certain. Yeah, He's dead. But he wasn't. Not yet. The faintest sound, a groan, a breath, came from inside the trunk as they drove toward Connecticut. Henry's stomach turned. Jimmy said nothing. Tommy just grinned. That night would live in the shadows forever, whispered in bars, retold in movies, written into history as one of the most brutal and senseless murders in the Mafia story. But for Billy Batts, it was just the final act of a tragedy he never saw coming. A man who lived by silence, killed by noise. A man who believed in respect, destroyed by pride. Back at the bar, the jukebox had stopped. The chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed. The floor was clean again, but if you looked close enough, you could still see it. A faint stain, a ghost of something that refused to fade. The city outside kept moving, oblivious. But for the men in that car, and for the legend they had just buried, nothing would ever be the same again. That was the night the old world died. The night the code of respect was replaced by chaos. And the night a man who should have stayed quiet, for once, didn't. Chapter 7. Go get a shine box. The air inside Robert's lounge was heavy with the kind of tension that nobody could see, but everybody could feel. Cigarette smoke curled upward through dim yellow light, swirling above the heads of men who had spent their lives pretending they didn't fear anything. The laughter had died down hours ago, replaced by quieter voices, by the dull hum of a jukebox that had played one too many Sinatra tunes. The ice had melted in the glasses, the jokes had lost their rhythm, and under the surface of it all, something was shifting. It was the kind of shift that comes before a storm, quiet, invisible, and unstoppable. Billy Batts was leaning against the bar, smiling. It was the same smile he'd worn his entire life, warm enough to disarm, confident enough to warn. He looked like a man at peace. He'd survived prison, survived the system, survived time itself. But that smile, the very thing that had once protected him, was now the last light in a room that was about to go dark. Tommy DeSimone was sitting a few stools away, staring into his drink like he was trying to drown something inside himself. The room buzzed with small talk, the clinking of glasses, but to Tommy, it was all background noise. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the music. He wasn't listening to anyone else. Not Henry, not Jimmy, not the laughter around him. He was listening to that voice in his head, the one that replayed Billy's words over and over again. Still shining shoes, kid? It wasn't even what Billy had said. It was what it meant. To everyone else, it was harmless banter, a passing joke, a nod to old times. But to Tommy, it was an insult, a knife disguised as nostalgia. The streets had taught him one thing. Respect was everything. Lose that, and you were finished. And now, in front of everyone, Billy had taken that respect from him with one sentence. Tommy's blood was boiling, but his face didn't show it yet. He smiled back, that dangerous, thin smile that hides more than it reveals. Henry Hill watched the exchange from across the room. He felt it immediately, the shift, the silent spark that only men like him could recognize. He knew Tommy too well, knew that when his smile got smaller, his temper got larger, knew that behind that forced laughter, something ugly was forming. He caught Jimmy's eye, a quick flicker of concern, but Jimmy didn't move. He just leaned back in his chair, taking a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling smoke like a man who had already seen too much to care. Billy kept talking, oblivious to the storm brewing across the bar. He was in his element, telling stories about the old days, about the time when men had honor, when deals were made with handshakes instead of bullets. His voice carried that charm, that authority that came from living through decades of chaos and still standing tall. But the more he talked, the smaller Tommy felt. Every word was like a reminder that he didn't belong in the same world. Billy represented everything Tommy hated: patience, respect, restraint. He was the past, and Tommy wanted to be the future. But in that moment, the future was starting to look a lot like revenge. Jimmy finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "All right, enough," he said, not to anyone in particular. It was the kind of thing you said to change the energy in a room without changing anything at all. Billy raised his glass in mock surrender, laughing. "Hey, I'm just breaking balls. You kids don't know how to take a joke anymore." The line was harmless, even funny, but it only tightened the knot in Tommy's chest. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp as a blade. The laughter stopped. All eyes turned to him. Tommy smiled again, but this time it was thin, almost trembling. "Nah, Billy's right," he said. "We don't know how to take a joke." His tone was friendly, but there was something underneath, a tremor of rage disguised as humor. Billy turned toward him, still smiling, still thinking it was just banter. "That's right," he said. "Maybe I should teach you." That was it, the match that finally hit the fuse. Tommy's hand moved fast, grabbing the nearest glass and hurling it across the room. It shattered against the wall, a burst of noise that silenced everything else. Then, before anyone could react, he lunged at Billy. The first hit came so hard it sounded like bone meeting wood. Billy stumbled, caught off guard. The second came faster, then the third. The room exploded into chaos. Jimmy was up now, but not to stop it. He moved toward them, his face cold, detached. Henry stood frozen, watching the scene unfold as if time had slowed. Tommy's fists were relentless. Each punch carried years of rage, frustration, and insecurity. He wasn't hitting Billy anymore. He was hitting every man who had ever looked down on him, every moment he'd been reminded of his place. Billy tried to defend himself, his hands up, but the blows kept coming. The bar shook with the sound of violence, the dull thuds, the gasps, the sickening rhythm of flesh meeting fury. Jimmy stepped in now, not to stop Tommy, but to help finish it. He grabbed Billy by the collar, slammed him against the bar, and hit him hard in the ribs. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he muttered, almost to himself. Henry moved toward them instinctively, but Jimmy's glare stopped him cold. "Stay out of it," Jimmy snapped. "It's done." But wasn't done. Billy was still breathing, coughing blood, his face a mess of swelling and color. He tried to speak, tried to say something, maybe an apology, maybe a plea, but the words never came out. Tommy hit him again, a wild swing that knocked him to the floor. Then he kicked him, over and over, until the only sound left in the room was the faint hum of the jukebox, still playing a song no one could hear anymore. When it finally stopped, Tommy stood there, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Jimmy was silent, his expression unreadable. Henry looked down at Billy, horrified. "Jesus Christ, Tommy," he whispered. "You killed him." Tommy wiped the sweat from his forehead, grinning. "Yeah," he said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "He got what he deserved." Jimmy bent down, checking for a pulse. "He's not dead," he said flatly. "Not yet." The words hung in the air, heavier than the smell of blood and whiskey. They all looked at each other, realizing what that meant. There was no going back now. Killing a made man without permission, that was the one rule no one was supposed to break. It wasn't just murder. It was suicide. But Tommy didn't care. In that moment, all he could feel was relief. Jimmy lit another cigarette, the flame flickering against his face. "We got to clean this up," he said quietly. "Now." Tommy nodded, his hands still shaking. Henry felt his stomach twist, the weight of what they'd just done sinking in. "What do we do?" he asked. Jimmy looked at him, his eyes cold. "We get him out of here," he said. "You drive." They moved fast. Tommy grabbed a tablecloth, dragging Billy's limp body onto it. The blood smeared across the floor like dark paint. Henry, try not to look, try not to hear the sound of fabric scraping against the floorboards. They wrapped him up tight, tied the ends, and carried him out the back door. The night was still and quiet, too quiet for what they were doing. The streetlights buzzed faintly above them as they lifted the body into the trunk of Henry's car. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the idling engine, the low hum of tires against pavement. Then, from inside the trunk, came a sound that froze them all, a muffled groan. Henry's hands tightened on the wheel. "He's alive," he whispered. Tommy leaned back in his seat, laughing. "Tough old bastard," he said. "Guess we'll finish the job later." Jimmy didn't laugh. He stared straight ahead, smoke curling from his lips. "Just drive," he said. And Henry did. They drove for hours, out of the city and into the emptiness of Connecticut. The night stretched long and cruel, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. No one spoke much. Tommy hummed to himself, his laughter fading in and out like static. Henry gripped the wheel tighter with every mile. Jimmy gave directions in that calm, controlled tone that made everything feel worse. When they finally pulled over, it was in the middle of nowhere, a dirt road surrounded by trees. The kind of place where screams go unheard and secrets last forever. They opened the trunk. Billy was still breathing, faintly. His face was barely recognizable, but his chest rose and fell, shallow and stubborn. Jimmy looked down at him, sighed, and shook his head. "Should have just stayed quiet," he muttered. Then he nodded at Tommy. Tommy didn't hesitate. He pulled out a knife from his boot and leaned in. Henry turned away. The sound that followed was sharp, wet, final. When it was over, the forest went silent again. Tommy stepped back, wiping the blade on his sleeve, his breath heavy but steady now. Jimmy tossed him a shovel. "Start digging," he said. They worked in silence. The ground was hard, the soil thick. Every scoop of dirt sounded louder than the last. Henry kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting headlights, half hoping for them. But none came. When the hole was deep enough, they lowered Billy in. His body thudded softly against the earth, the last sound he would ever make. Tommy stood over the grave for a moment, breathing hard, before spitting into it. "Go shine your F*** on G shoes now," he said. Jimmy threw the first shovel of dirt. Then Henry, reluctantly. Then Tommy. Within minutes, the hole was filled. The ground looked the same as it had before, like nothing had ever happened. They stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. Then Jimmy turned, climbed back into the car, and said quietly, "Let's go." As they drove back toward the city, the silence between them was unbearable. Henry stared out the window. The image of Billy's face burned into his memory. Jimmy sat motionless, thinking, always thinking. And Tommy smiled. Not out of joy, not even pride, but out of something darker. The feeling of having proven something, even if he couldn't name what. But in the Mafia, nothing stays buried forever. Billy Batts wasn't just another man. He was made. His death would ripple through the underworld like shockwaves through water. And for Tommy DeSimone, for Jimmy Burke, for Henry Hill, this night would never really end. They had crossed the one line you were never supposed to cross. And though the dirt might hide the body, it couldn't hide the consequences. Somewhere far away, the city kept breathing. Lights flickered in apartment windows. Music played in bars. Laughter echoed in alleys. But in that car, driving through the night, 3 men sat in silence, each one pretending they hadn't just buried their future along with Billy Batts. And back in Queens, in that small bar called Robert's Lounge, the stain on the floor never really went away. Chapter 8. The setup. The night after the party, Queens was still wet from a light summer rain. The streets shimmered under the glow of the street lights, reflecting a world that looked calm, but wasn't. Somewhere, beneath that calm surface, a secret had already begun to rot. The kind of secret that eats its way through everyone it touches, slow and silent. In the days following Billy Batts's so-called welcome home celebration, everything looked normal. The bar reopened, the laughter returned, the jukebox played again. But behind those smiles, the men who had killed him were already watching the world too closely. They were waiting for questions that hadn't yet been asked, dreading knocks that hadn't yet come. Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, and Tommy DeSimone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Killing a made man without permission wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. It wasn't some neighborhood score or a bar fight gone wrong. It was a sin against the system itself, against the invisible architecture that kept the Mafia from devouring itself completely. And in the hours after it happened, Jimmy and Henry both knew that the real work had just begun. Killing Billy Batts was the easy part. Making him disappear, that was the real test. Jimmy's mind worked like a machine. Cold, quiet, and ruthless. He didn't panic. He never did. That's what made him dangerous. As he stood outside Robert's Lounge that night, looking down the empty street. His face was expressionless. But behind those still eyes, 100 calculations were unfolding. Who would notice Billy was missing first? How long would it take before someone started asking where he went after the party? How deep would the hole have to be to bury both a body and a mistake? Inside the bar, Henry was pacing, his nerves unraveling. He wasn't built for this part of the life. He could handle hustles, scores, drugs, scams, but murder, real murder, was different, especially this one. Billy wasn't some rival, some civilian, some name on a list. He was one of their own, a made man. Henry's voice trembled when he spoke. "What are we going to do, Jimmy? He's Gambino. They'll kill us all for this." Jimmy didn't look at him. He just said, "We're going to clean up. You don't leave a mess for people to find." Tommy was sitting at the bar, staring at his blood-stained hands like they belonged to someone else. The adrenaline had faded, and what was left was something raw, something hollow. He wasn't scared. Tommy didn't do fear. But he was restless. He kept laughing under his breath, shaking his head like he was replaying the fight again. Each punch, each scream. He said, almost proudly, the guy had it coming. Should have kept his mouth shut. Jimmy glanced at him, sharp and cold. "He was a made guy, Tommy," he said quietly. "You don't kill a made guy without a green light." Tommy smirked. Then maybe they should have lit it green sooner. It wasn't bravado anymore. It was madness. And in that moment, Jimmy knew he wasn't dealing with logic. He was dealing with something much more dangerous, pride wrapped in youth. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just took a deep breath and said, "We'll deal with that later. For now, we gotta move him. Tonight." Henry's car was parked out back, a beige Pontiac that still smelled new. The trunk, though, was a different story. The carpet inside was stained, still damp from what had happened the night before. Henry had tried not to look when they loaded Billy's body in there, but the image wouldn't leave his head. The sound of the body hitting the metal, the weight, the smell of blood and whiskey. He could still hear the faint groan, that proof that Billy had still been alive when they drove him out of the city. Henry had turned up the radio that night, trying to drown it out, but no song could cover that sound. Now, Jimmy told him to open the trunk again. "We gotta check," he said. Henry hesitated. "Check what?" Jimmy looked at him. "That he's still dead." They lifted the trunk lid slowly. The stench hit first, thick and metallic like rust and rot. Billy's body was twisted awkwardly, wrapped in a stained tablecloth from the bar. His face was swollen, unrecognizable, his suit torn, his hands half clenched as if still trying to fight. He wasn't breathing, not anymore. Jimmy stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll move him before sunrise." Henry swallowed hard. "Where?" Jimmy exhaled smoke from his cigarette. "I know a place. Farm out in Connecticut. Quiet. No one around." It wasn't the first time Jimmy had buried something out there, and it wouldn't be the last. He had a knack for finding the kind of places that didn't exist on maps. A dirt road, a few trees, an empty patch of land that didn't ask questions. It was the perfect kind of nowhere. Tommy was already smiling again. "Let's go then, before somebody sees us." They drove through the night, the car cutting through the empty streets like a ghost. The city lights gave way to darkness, the kind of black that felt alive. Henry's hands were shaking on the wheel. Every shadow looked like a police cruiser. Every set of headlights in the distance made his chest tighten. Tommy, in the back seat, kept humming to himself, that same Sinatra tune that had played at the bar. Jimmy sat beside Henry, calm as ever, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "Slow down," he'd say every few miles. "Don't draw attention." They reached the field just before dawn. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. A layer of fog hung low over the grass. Jimmy got out first, stretching his back, then motioned to the others. "Grab the shovels." They'd brought two, one from the bar's basement, another from the trunk of Jimmy's own car. Tommy and Henry dug while Jimmy watched. The sound of metal hitting soil was the only sound in the world. It was slow work, made harder by exhaustion and fear. Every time Henry's shovel hit a root, he flinched, half expecting to see blue lights flashing through the trees. When the hole was finally deep enough, Jimmy nodded. "Bring him." They unwrapped Billy from the tablecloth. The night air hit his skin, pale under the rising dawn. For a moment, even Tommy was quiet. It was the first time he looked at what he'd done, not the act, but the result. The violence that had felt righteous the night before now looked small and stupid in the cold light of morning. He muttered something under his breath, too soft to hear, then helped lower the body into the hole. Jimmy looked down one last time. "That's it," he said. "He's gone." They covered him quickly, the dirt falling in uneven thuds. When the last of it was done, Jimmy stamped it down with his shoe, leaving no trace. No marker. No cross. "Nothing," he said. "This never happened." As they stood there, Henry couldn't stop staring at the patch of ground. It looked so ordinary, so quiet, but he knew what was under it. He knew what it meant. It wasn't just a man buried there. It was the end of something, the old world, the code, the illusion that there were still rules in their business. On the drive back, no one spoke. The sun had risen now, painting the highway in dull gold. Tommy eventually broke the silence with a laugh. "Well," he said, "that's one less problem." Jimmy didn't answer. Henry wanted to scream. Back in Queens, life went on. The bar reopened like nothing had happened. Men came and went, laughing, drinking, telling stories. But the silence between the three of them grew heavier with each passing day. Every time a car slowed down near the bar, Henry froze. Every time the phone rang, Jimmy looked up from his drink. Every night, Tommy laughed a little too loud. Days turned into weeks. No one asked about Billy, not yet. But the whispers started. A made man had gone missing. A Gambino. The streets don't keep secrets for long, and this was a secret too big to stay buried. The Gambinos started asking quiet questions, then louder ones. Billy's family reported him missing. His old friends started poking around. The pressure built slowly, like water behind a dam. Jimmy kept his composure. "Don't talk to anyone," he told Henry. "If someone asks, you don't know a thing." Henry nodded, but his nerves were cracking. Every night he'd dream of that trunk, that sound, that dirt. Tommy, though, acted like nothing had happened. He bragged about other things, about new scores, new money. But beneath the surface, he was slipping. His temper was worse. His ego bigger. The kind of thing that draws attention in a life that depends on being invisible. Jimmy began to worry, not about the Gambinos, but about Tommy. You can hide a body, but you can't hide a man who can't shut up. One night, weeks after the murder, Tommy stormed into the bar drunk, shouting about how nobody messes with me. Henry tried to calm him down, but Jimmy just stared at him, his eyes cold and tired. "You're gonna get us all killed," he said. Tommy laughed. "Relax, Jimmy. Nobody's looking for him. He's fertilizer now." But they were looking. The Gambinos had people everywhere. Word had already reached John Gotti, a name that still carried weight in the underworld's darkest corners. Gotti wasn't the kind of man to let an insult go unanswered, especially not one involving a made man. The whispers turned to plans. Quiet revenge. Balancing the books the old-fashioned way. Jimmy heard it too, and he knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the past clawed its way out of the dirt they'd buried it in. The bar remained their meeting place, their stage of normalcy. But everything that happened there now had a shadow. Every laugh had a weight. Every drink had a taste of guilt. Jimmy was quieter, his charm now cold and distant. Henry was jumpy, his paranoia bleeding into his every move. And Tommy, in his arrogance, believed the storm had passed. But storms don't pass in the Mafia. They just wait. In the early hours one morning, Jimmy sat alone at a table, staring at his reflection in an empty glass. The bar was quiet. The city outside hummed softly. He thought about Billy, about his smile, about that night, about the way things used to be. He wasn't a sentimental man, but there was something about it that stayed with him. Not regret, not exactly. More like a bitter acknowledgement of what had changed. Once upon a time, a man like Billy would have been untouchable. Now, he was gone, and the world kept spinning. He muttered to himself, "The world's gone to hell," and took another drink. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the narrow streets. Somewhere out there, men were still searching for Billy Bats, his friends, his family, his crew. They'd never find him. But the truth was, they didn't need to. Because even without a body, his death had already set something in motion. A chain of events that would swallow everyone involved. The setup wasn't the murder. The setup was the lie they had to live with afterward. The silence that had to be maintained. The paranoia that would eat them alive from the inside. The Mafia always had a way of balancing its books. And though Jimmy didn't know when, he knew how it would end. Not with a trial. Not with forgiveness. But with another night, another drive, another quiet disappearance. Billy Batts was buried, but his ghost was just getting started. Chapter 9. The Beating. The night had gone still again, the way it always does after chaos. The kind of stillness that presses on your chest, that makes even your heartbeat sound too loud. But inside Robert's lounge, nothing was still. There were stains on the floor that no mop could really erase, dents in the wood where fists had slammed, and a silence that felt heavier than any sound. The jukebox had been shut off, the laughter gone, the smell of whiskey and blood still clinging to the air like fog. What had happened there wasn't just another bar fight. It was a rupture, a moment when everything that held their world together cracked open and showed what it really was. A place where respect was currency, and one wrong word could bankrupt your life. Billy Batts lay on the floor, barely conscious, his once pristine suit torn and soaked with blood. His face was unrecognizable, a swollen mask of purple and red. One of his shoes had come off, lying a few feet away, its shine dulled by the dirt and chaos. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, not even now. The man who had once teased a kid about shining shoes was now bleeding on the same floor where that kid, all grown and furious, had beaten him half to death. But even as his body failed him, there was still something defiant in him, something that refused to die quietly. Billy Batts was a made man, and even broken and bleeding, he carried that pride like a curse. Jimmy Burke stood over him, his breath steady, his face unreadable. He wasn't panicking. Jimmy never panicked. His mind was already past the fight, past the shock, working through the next steps. This wasn't about what had just happened. It was about what would come next. Killing a made man was one thing. Getting away with it was another. Henry Hill stood nearby, frozen, still trying to understand how a night that began with laughter had ended in blood. His hands were shaking, his throat dry, his thoughts spinning in circles. He'd seen beatings before, plenty of them, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. Tommy DeSimone was still breathing hard, pacing, his knuckles raw and red. He was covered in Billy's blood, his shirt torn, his eyes wild and unfocused. There was no triumph in him now, no satisfaction, just something hollow, a kind of stunned disbelief at what he'd done. He muttered to himself, fragments of curses and excuses, half laughing like a man who had lost his grip on reality. Every few seconds, he'd glance back at Billy, as if expecting him to stand up again, to throw another insult, to give him another reason to keep hitting. But Billy didn't move. Henry tried to speak, his voice trembling. "He's gonna die," he said quietly. Jimmy looked up, his eyes cold. "He's already dead," he replied, though they both knew he wasn't. Billy let out a faint groan, low and broken. The sound made Henry's stomach twist. Tommy heard it too. He turned, his face twisting into something between anger and fear. "You hear that?" he said, half laughing again. "He's still talking. He don't know when to quit." Jimmy gave him a long look, then shut him up. The next few seconds stretched like hours. Tommy grabbed a pistol from his waistband and stepped closer, his shadow falling over Billy. There was no ceremony in it, no hesitation. He brought the gun down hard, not to shoot but to strike again and again. The sound of metal cracking against bone echoed through the room, each blow duller than the last. Henry turned away, unable to watch, the sound filling his ears anyway. Jimmy just stood there, motionless, letting it happen. When Tommy finally stopped, panting, his face was slick with sweat, his shirt clinging to him. He dropped the gun to his side and said quietly, "Now he's done." But Billy wasn't. Somehow, impossibly, he was still breathing. Each breath was a struggle, wet and uneven, but he was alive. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was just the stubborn will of a man who refused to let his killers have the satisfaction of watching him die. Jimmy crouched down beside him, studying his face. "You should have just stayed quiet, Billy," he murmured. "You'd still be breathing easy." He stood up again, wiped his hands on his jacket, and turned to Henry. "Get the car." Henry hesitated. "Now." Jimmy's eyes narrowed. "You think we're waiting for him to heal?" The three men moved quickly, but every step felt like a lifetime. They lifted Billy's body, heavy, limp, still twitching faintly, and wrapped him in a tablecloth from the bar. Henry gagged at the smell, at the sight of the blood soaking through the fabric. Tommy was silent now, his earlier rage replaced by a strange calm. It wasn't remorse. It was something colder, the kind of calm that comes after you've crossed a line and realize there's no way back. They dragged the body out the back door, the night swallowing them whole. The rain had started again, soft but relentless, pattering against the asphalt. They loaded Billy into the trunk of Henry's car, his body folding awkwardly inside. Jimmy shut the trunk with a dull thud, the sound final, echoing through the empty street. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the rain and their own breathing. Henry climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling so badly he could barely turn the key. Jimmy sat beside him, lighting a cigarette like it was any other night. Tommy sat in the back, staring out the window, his reflection pale and ghost-like in the glass. As the car pulled away, the silence inside was louder than the storm outside. They drove through the city without speaking. Every red light felt like a trap. Every passing car looked like danger. Henry's mind was racing, trying to keep up with his fear. What would happen if they got caught? What if someone saw them? What if Billy wasn't dead and somehow made it out alive? Each thought came faster than the last, until he felt like he couldn't breathe. Jimmy noticed, of course. He always noticed. "Relax," he said, his tone calm but sharp. "We're just taking out the trash." But even as he said it, Jimmy knew this wasn't trash. This was a man, a made man, someone the Gambino family would not forget. He took a long drag from his cigarette, staring ahead into the darkness. "We dump him. We disappear for a while. Nobody says nothing. Understand?" Henry nodded, though his voice failed him. Tommy laughed softly, shaking his head. "I thought he could talk to me like that. Like I'm still a kid. Nobody talks to me like that." His laughter turned into a cough, rough and bitter. He should have stayed quiet. They drove out past the city limits, where the lights faded and the roads turned to winding stretches of nothing. The fields on either side of them were dark and endless, stretching into the unknown. Henry's nerves were shot, his hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Every few miles, there'd be a sound from the trunk, a faint thud, a movement, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Each time, Henry froze. The third time it happened, Tommy leaned forward, grinning. "He's still alive," he said. Jimmy didn't even look at him. "Then we finish it when we stop." When they finally pulled onto a dirt road in Connecticut, the car came to a slow stop. The rain had eased, leaving only mist and the low hum of crickets. The three men stepped out, the mud soft beneath their shoes. Jimmy opened the trunk. The sight made Henry turn away. Billy's eyes were open, not wide, not conscious, but open. His body twitched, a faint, broken movement that was more reflex than life. Tommy stared down at him, shaking his head in disbelief. "This guy," he muttered. "He just won't die." Jimmy handed him a knife. "Then make sure he does." There was no hesitation. Tommy leaned in, quick and brutal, the sound muffled by the fog. When it was over, there was no more movement. Jimmy watched for a moment, then nodded. "That's it. Dig." They dug with shovels from the trunk, the soil wet and heavy. Henry's hands blistered, his body numb. Every scoop of dirt felt like an act of desperation. When the hole was finally deep enough, they lowered Billy in. Jimmy didn't look down for long. He just flicked his cigarette into the grave and said quietly, he should have known better. They filled the hole, each shovel of dirt landing with a dull, final thud. The air was thick, the world eerily quiet. When it was done, they stood there in silence, staring at the ground. Tommy broke it first. "You think they'll find him?" he asked. Jimmy looked at him, his face hard. "Only if you open your mouth." Back in the car, Henry couldn't stop shaking. His mind was spinning, replaying the sound of fists, the sight of blood, the look on Billy's face before it all went dark. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Jimmy noticed. He put a hand on Henry's shoulder, firm but not unkind. "Forget it," he said. "You don't talk about it. You don't think about it. It's done." But it wasn't done. Not really. They drove back toward the city in silence. The sun was rising now, pale light breaking through the clouds. It painted everything in shades of gray. The car, the road, their faces. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The truth sat between them, heavy and unspoken. They had killed a made man. They had crossed the one line that could never be uncrossed. And whether they admitted it or not, they all knew what that meant. When they finally reached Queens, the city was waking up. People were walking dogs, opening shops, starting their days. The world didn't stop for Billy Bats. It never did for men like him. Jimmy told Henry to drop him off near his house. "We'll talk later," he said, stepping out into the gray morning light. Tommy followed, his confidence back now, his grin back in place. He slapped the roof of the car. "See? Easy," he said. "We did what had to be done." He turned to leave, but Henry caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, the grin, the swagger, and behind it, something else, something hollow. Henry drove home alone, the city blurring past him. The smell of blood and gasoline filled the car. He didn't know it yet, but that night would haunt him forever. The sounds, the sights, the silence after the violence. They would replay in his mind for years, over and over, like a song stuck on a broken record. The beating of Billy Bats wasn't just one man's death. It was the end of an era, the death of the old Mafia, of its codes and rules, of the illusion of honor among thieves. The world had changed, and the men who had buried Billy Bats didn't just bury a body that night. They buried the last trace of respect their world would ever know. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind that comes before the echo, the kind that waits, the kind that reminds men that every crime, no matter how deep it's buried, still breathes beneath the dirt, and sooner or later, the earth always gives it back. Chapter 10. The Burial in Connecticut. The night had turned to gray when the car rolled to a stop. The headlights carved through a fog that seemed alive, curling around the trees like smoke from a dying fire. They were miles away from the city now. No sirens, no traffic, no streetlights. Just an empty field off an old dirt road somewhere in Connecticut. The kind of place that didn't exist on any map, where secrets could stay buried longer than memories. The engine ticked as it cooled, and the silence that followed was heavier than the air itself. Inside the car, the smell was unbearable, blood, sweat, and decay mixed into a single odor that made even Jimmy Burke's stomach turn. For hours they had driven through the night with Billy Bats in the trunk, his body folded like something less than human, his presence lingering like a ghost they couldn't outrun. Henry Hill sat in the driver's seat, both hands gripping the wheel, even though the car was stopped. His knuckles were white, his face pale and drawn. He couldn't bring himself to look in the rearview mirror, because every time he did, he swore he saw the trunk move. Jimmy sat beside him, calm as ever, smoke rising from the cigarette dangling between his lips. His mind was already ahead, thinking about the burial, the cleanup, the alibis. Tommy DeSimone, in the back seat, was humming. The same song from the jukebox, the one that had been playing when he snapped. His voice was soft, tuneless, almost childlike. It was the sound of a man trying to keep his thoughts from catching up to him. Jimmy finally broke the silence. "Pull over here," he said. His voice was steady, almost casual, but Henry could feel the weight behind it. Henry nodded, pulling off onto the shoulder. The tires crunched over gravel. Jimmy looked out the window, scanning the tree line. "Yeah," he said finally. "This'll do." The three men stepped out into the cold morning air. It smelled of rain and dirt and something faintly metallic. Henry took a deep breath, trying to steady his hands. His body still ached from tension. Tommy stretched, his shirt stiff with dried blood, and cracked his neck like this was just another job. Jimmy walked to the back of the car, flicked his cigarette into the mud, and nodded for Henry to open the trunk. The hinges creaked as the lid lifted. For a moment, the rising mist looked like it came from inside the car. Billy's body was still there, twisted, his suit torn open, his skin already turning gray. But his eyes were open. Dead eyes, yes, but open. Henry staggered back, muttering a curse under his breath. Tommy stepped closer, peering inside like a kid checking on his prize. "He's done," he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Jimmy grabbed a shovel from the back seat. "We're wasting daylight," he said. "Let's get it done." They started walking toward the edge of the woods. The ground squelched beneath their shoes, soft from the night's rain. The fog hung low, wrapping around them until the car disappeared behind a white curtain. Jimmy found a spot near a cluster of trees, kicked at the dirt with his shoe, and nodded. "Here." He handed one of the shovels to Tommy and the other to Henry. Tommy smirked. "You give the tools to the workers." "Huh," he said. Jimmy didn't answer. He just lit another cigarette and watched. Henry hesitated before he began digging. The soil was heavy and damp, and every scoop made the smell worse. The silence was broken only by the sound of shovels hitting earth. After a while, Tommy started to whistle, off-key and slow, until Jimmy told him to shut up. When the hole was deep enough, Jimmy walked back to the car, his footsteps fading into the fog. Henry leaned on his shovel, his body trembling from exhaustion and nerves. "You ever think about what we're doing?" he asked quietly. Tommy looked at him, squinting through the smoke from Jimmy's cigarette glowing in the distance. "What's there to think about?" Tommy said. "He's dead. We're alive. That's the only math that matters." Henry wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his mind numb. He just nodded and kept digging. A few minutes later, Jimmy returned, dragging the body behind him. The sound of it scraping across the ground was worse than the beating itself. Billy's limbs bent unnaturally, his once slick hair matted with dirt and blood. His face, what was left of it, was barely human anymore. Jimmy dropped the body beside the hole and took a breath. "All right," he said. "Let's finish it." For a moment, no one moved. The three of them stood there, staring down at what they'd done. The fog curled around them, muffling the world in the silence. There was no wind, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of the car engine they'd left running. Henry looked at Billy's face and felt something he hadn't expected. Pity. Not for the man he was, but for the ghost he'd become. For the way everything that had once made him feared and respected was now just gone, buried under blood and dirt. Tommy broke the spell. "All right, enough sightseeing," he said, wiping his hands on his pants. "In he goes." They grabbed the body, one at the shoulders, one at the legs. He was heavy, too heavy. The dead always are. The smell made Henry gag, but he didn't stop. They lowered him into the hole, his body landing with a dull, wet thud. For a few seconds, no one said anything. The silence was absolute. Then Jimmy stepped forward, his voice low. "Rest in peace, Billy," he said, not out of respect but out of habit. It was the kind of thing you said when there was nothing else left to say. They began to shovel dirt over him. Each scoop made a sound that stuck in Henry's chest. It didn't sound like dirt hitting the ground. It sounded like closing a door. With every shovel of earth, Billy Batts disappeared a little more. His face, his suit, his life, all swallowed by the ground. Tommy worked fast, like he couldn't wait to be done. Jimmy took his time, every movement controlled. Henry's hands were blistered by the time it was over. When the last bit of dirt was flattened, the ground looked untouched. A clean slate. But it wasn't clean. It never would be. Jimmy stood back, staring at the patch of earth. "Nobody comes here," he said quietly. "Not farmers, not hikers, not even animals. He's gone." Tommy leaned on his shovel, smirking. "Good riddance." Henry couldn't look at him. He turned away, walking back toward the car, his legs trembling. Every step felt heavier than the last. Back at the car, the smell was worse. The trunk still reeked, the interior tainted by what had been inside it. Jimmy looked around the ground, making sure they hadn't left anything behind. He wiped his hands with a rag and tossed it into the woods. "All right," he said. "Let's get the hell out of here." The drive back was longer than the one before. Nobody talked. The sun was coming up now, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. To Henry, it looked like blood. The road was quiet, empty except for the sound of the tires humming against the asphalt. Tommy lit a cigarette and cracked the window. The wind carried the smoke out, but not the stench of death that clung to them. At one point, Tommy broke the silence. "You think anybody's going to miss him?" he asked. Jimmy didn't look at him. "Everybody gets missed," he said. "The question is, who's going to ask?" Henry stared straight ahead, his mind drifting. He thought about Billy's smile, the way he'd laughed that night, the sound of his voice before it all went wrong. He thought about how one moment could erase a lifetime, how a joke could become a death sentence. When they finally reached the city, the world was already awake. The smell of fresh bread drifted from bakeries. Kids ran to school. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Life was moving on. Nobody knew that just hours ago, 3 men had buried a legend. Nobody knew that beneath a quiet field in Connecticut, the earth was holding a secret that would outlive them all. Jimmy told Henry to drop him off near his house. "Go home, take a shower, burn your clothes," he said. "You didn't see anything, you didn't do anything, you don't know anything." His voice was calm, almost fatherly. Henry nodded, numb. Tommy leaned forward from the back seat, grinning. "We make a good team." "Huh," he said. "Maybe next time, I'll pick the spot." Jimmy turned to look at him, his eyes hard. "There ain't going to be a next time, Tommy. You hear me?" Tommy laughed, brushing it off, but the edge in Jimmy's tone was real. He was thinking ahead, already realizing that Tommy's recklessness might one day bury more than just a body. Henry drove home alone. His clothes were ruined, his mind fogged. When he got inside, he stripped down, threw everything into the bathtub, and poured bleach over it. The smell filled the small apartment. He stood under the shower for what felt like hours, trying to wash the night off his skin. But no matter how hot the water got, it wouldn't come off. The image of Billy's face, the sound of the dirt hitting the ground, it was burned into him. He saw it when he closed his eyes. He'd see it for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, back in Queens, Robert's Lounge reopened like nothing had ever happened. The same regulars, the same music, the same jokes. Only the floorboards knew the truth. The blood had been scrubbed away, but if you looked close enough, you could still see it, the faint, dark lines that told the story nobody else could. Jimmy went back to business. Tommy went back to boasting. Henry tried to pretend it had all been a bad dream. Days turned into weeks. The news spread quietly through the underworld. Billy Batts was missing. His friends in the Gambino family started asking questions. Where was he last seen? Who was he with? The whispers pointed toward Robert's Lounge, toward Jimmy Burke's crew. But without a body, there was nothing to prove. The police didn't care much, just another gangster gone missing. But in the Mafia, a missing made man was a wound that demanded blood. The paranoia started to build. Jimmy could feel it in the air, in every handshake, in every look that lingered too long. The Gambinos were patient, but not forgiving. And patience, in their world, was just another way of saying, we're waiting for the right time. Jimmy knew it was coming. Sooner or later, someone would come looking. He'd buried Billy's body deep, but he couldn't bury the mistake. Months later, word came that the land they'd used was being developed. A new house, new construction, heavy machinery. Jimmy's heart dropped when he heard. He gathered Henry and Tommy that night. "We gotta move him," he said flatly. Henry stared at him, horrified. "You're kidding." Jimmy shook his head. "No, we dig him up. Tonight." And so they did. Back to the same field, back to the same fog, back to the same silence. The ground was harder this time, frozen from the cold. They dug until their hands bled. The smell hit first, the unmistakable stench of rot and death. Henry almost vomited. Tommy cursed under his breath. Jimmy said nothing. They pulled the remains out of the dirt, wrapped them up again, and moved them deeper into the woods. Another grave. Another lie. Another night, erased by morning. When it was over, they stood there again, staring at the disturbed ground. "Now he's gone for good," Tommy said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Jimmy didn't answer. He just stared at the trees, lost in thought. Maybe he knew, even then, that you can't bury guilt. Not deep enough. Not forever. The drive back was silent. The air in the car was thick, heavy with something that had no name. The men didn't speak. They didn't need to. Each one of them knew that the hole they had dug in that field wasn't just for Billy Bats. It was for themselves too. Because from that moment on, everything they touched, everything they built, would be haunted by the dirt that still clung to their hands. And though the world would move on, though their names would echo in bars and movies and books, the truth stayed there in that quiet Connecticut field. A reminder that in the world they lived in, no one ever really disappears. The earth remembers everything. Chapter 11. Whispers of Retribution. The weeks after Billy Bats vanished slid by in a kind of uneasy quiet that felt less like peace and more like the pause before thunder. In their world, people disappeared all the time. Sometimes it was business, sometimes it was bad luck, sometimes it was both. But this was different. Billy wasn't some nobody. He wasn't a loudmouth hustler or a careless thief who crossed the wrong man. He was made. And that word, made, still meant something, even in an age when most of the young guys were too coked up or reckless to understand what respect really cost. A made man didn't just go missing. If he did, it meant something terrible had happened, and someone, somewhere was going to answer for it. Jimmy Burke had been in the life long enough to know the rules. For every action, there's a reaction. For every body that disappears, another door opens, and not the kind you want to walk through. He didn't say it out loud, but he could feel the air changing around him. It was in the way people looked at him in bars now, a little too long, a little too curious. It was in the phone calls that suddenly went unanswered, in the conversations that went quiet when he walked into the room. He didn't need anyone to tell him. The word was spreading. The Gambinos were asking questions. And even if no one said his name yet, it was only a matter of time. Henry Hill tried to go back to normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. The nights were longer, the drinks stronger, and the laughter emptier. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Billy's face, or what was left of it, the dirt covering him, the sound of the shovel hitting the ground. He could still hear the dull echo of the trunk closing, could still smell the mixture of blood and metal that had filled the car. He'd been in bad situations before, but this one felt like a curse that clung to his skin. He started drinking more, talking less, looking over his shoulder every few blocks. Paranoia wasn't new to him, but this time it had a name. Tommy DeSimone, on the other hand, acted like nothing had happened. If anything, he was more reckless now. He laughed louder, spent more, bragged more. He'd always been a hothead, but now there was something darker in him, something manic. He'd sit at Robert's lounge, holding court like he was invincible, throwing money around like a man daring the world to stop him. The others noticed. They whispered about him when he wasn't there. Some said the beating had flipped a switch in his head. Others said it had made him feel untouchable. Both were true. Jimmy watched him carefully. He'd known Tommy since he was a kid, knew his temper, his pride, his lack of control. But now Tommy was more than just dangerous. He was unpredictable. One night, Jimmy pulled him aside after the bar closed. "You need to keep quiet about that night," he said softly. Tommy rolled his eyes. "Relax, Jimmy. Nobody's saying nothing. He's fertilizer by now." Jimmy's jaw tightened. "That's not the point. You killed a made man. That means somebody, somewhere, wants to know why. So keep your mouth shut." Tommy grinned, leaning back in his chair. "If they want to know, let him come ask me. I'll tell him why." Causey mouthed off. Jimmy stared at him for a long moment. "You talk too much," he said quietly. "One day, that's going to be the end of you." Tommy laughed. "Not today." The city didn't care about the storm brewing beneath its surface. Queens kept moving, cars kept honking, deals kept happening in bars and backrooms. But inside the circles that ran New York's underworld, the disappearance of Billy Bats was more than a mystery. It was an insult. The Gambinos weren't stupid. They knew who he'd been with that night. They knew where he'd gone. But without a body, without proof, they couldn't act. At least not yet. So they waited. And in that waiting, the whispers grew. Jimmy's phone started ringing more often, but the calls were shorter. "Hey, Jimmy," someone would say, too casually. "You hear about Billy? He ever make it home that night?" Jimmy would play dumb, the same tone he used when talking to cops. "Nah, haven't seen him since the party. You know how guys are. Maybe he took off with a girl or something." Every time he said it, he felt the weight of the lie dig a little deeper into his chest. Henry noticed it too. The tension, the shift in the air. Guys who used to hang around the bar started disappearing, laying low. The gamblers got quieter, the money slowed down. Everyone was waiting for the hammer to fall. And in their world, it always did. But the days turned into weeks, and nothing happened. Billy's name started fading from conversation. The cops didn't care. To them, he was just another missing gangster in a city full of them. And the Gambinos, for all their power, had bigger things to worry about. So the silence stretched. Too long. Long enough for Tommy to start believing he'd gotten away with it. Then one night, months later, Jimmy got a call from a friend in Brooklyn. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "You here?" the man said. "They're asking again. About bats." Jimmy's stomach sank. "Who's asking?" There was a pause. Gotti. John Gotti wasn't boss yet, but he had pull, and more importantly, he had pride. Billy Bats had been his man, and men like Gotti didn't let their guys vanish without consequences. If Gotti was asking questions now, it meant he wasn't just curious. It meant he was getting ready to make an example. Jimmy didn't sleep that night. He sat in his kitchen, a glass of whiskey sweating on the table, the radio playing low. His mind went back to that night in the field, the fog, the dirt, the sound of the shovel hitting the ground. He could still see Billy's open eyes. He thought about how fragile everything really was. How one bad decision could turn an empire into dust. By morning, he had a plan. Not a perfect one, but one that might buy them time. He called Henry first. "We're moving him," he said flatly. Henry blinked, still half asleep. "Moving who?" "Don't be stupid," Jimmy snapped. "You know who." A week later, they were back on that same dirt road, the fog thicker, the air colder. They dug for hours, the ground frozen and unyielding. When the shovel hit something soft, Henry turned away, gagging. The smell was worse this time. Sweet, sickly, unforgettable. Jimmy didn't flinch. He just kept working. They pulled what was left of Billy out of the ground, wrapped him again, and buried him deeper, in another spot, further away. "Nobody'll ever find him now," Jimmy said when it was done. But even he didn't believe it. Back in the city, life pretended to go on. Henry buried himself in schemes, airline scams, hijacks, anything that would keep him busy. Jimmy focused on business, trying to keep the money flowing, the silence intact. And Tommy got worse. He started using more coke, getting more violent, more erratic. One night, after too many drinks, he bragged about the killing again. Not to the crew, but to a girl. "Guy mouthed off, so I shut him up," he said, laughing. The next morning, that girl was gone. Vanished. Maybe she left. Maybe she didn't. Nobody ever saw her again. By late 70, the balance had shifted. The Luccheses, the family Tommy worked under, were starting to feel pressure. The Gambinos were watching. Gotti had his eyes on the streets, on every rumor, every whisper. Word spread that he wanted answers. Jimmy started making calls again, try to smooth things over, trying to remind people of old favors, old loyalties. But in the Mafia, favors expire the second blood hits the ground. The tension finally reached Tommy. One night, Jimmy called him. His tone was friendly, almost cheerful. "Good news, kid," he said. "They're making you." Tommy's eyes went wide. "You serious?" "Yeah," Jimmy said. "Paulie's guys talked to the Gambinos, and they're going to make you official. Tomorrow morning. We're something nice." For Tommy, it was everything. Being made wasn't just a promotion. It was immortality. It meant safety, respect, belonging. It meant no one could ever touch him again. He hung up that night with a grin that wouldn't fade, already planning what he'd say in the ceremony, how he'd celebrate after. But Jimmy knew the truth. There was no ceremony, no celebration, just payback. The Gambinos had finally decided how they'd balance the books. They weren't coming for Jimmy or Henry. They were coming for the man who'd thrown the first punch. Tommy left his house early the next morning, wearing a brand new suit. His wife kissed him goodbye, smiling proud. "Big day?" she asked. Tommy winked. "You have no idea. He never came back. No one ever found his body. Not a bone, not a shred of clothing. Just whispers. Some said he was shot in the back of the head the second he walked through the door. Others said he saw it coming and didn't fight." Jimmy got the call that afternoon. A voice on the line, cold and final. "It's done." He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't have to. When Henry heard, he didn't say anything. He just sat in silence, staring at the wall. For a long time, no one spoke about it. Not Jimmy, not Henry, not anyone. But they all knew. The debt had been paid. The balance restored. Billy Batts was still buried somewhere in Connecticut. The earth above him had hardened, his name fading into legend. But his death had sent out ripples that never stopped moving. It was the beginning of the end for all of them. The moment when the quiet codes that once ruled their world finally collapsed under the weight of pride and blood. In the end, no one really wins in that life. They survive for a while, they laugh, they spend, they kill. But every debt comes due. Every whisper turns into a knock. And the ground beneath them, no matter how deep they dig, always remembers what it's holding. Jimmy sat alone in the bar one night. Long after closing, the lights dim, the room empty. He poured himself a drink and stared at the wall where the blood once splattered, faint and invisible now. He raised his glass, not to celebrate, not to mourn, but to acknowledge. "You should have stayed quiet, Billy," he muttered. "We all should have." Outside, the city roared on, loud and indifferent. Inside, the silence swallowed him whole. Chapter 12. The Weight of Silence. The world didn't stop after Tommy disappeared. It never did. Not for the dead, not for the missing, not even for the ones left breathing under the crushing weight of what they'd done. In Queens, life carried on as if nothing had happened. The bars still filled at night, the money still changed hands, and the streets still whispered the same lies that kept men like Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill alive a little longer. But underneath all of it, something had shifted. There was a kind of invisible tension in the air now, a heaviness that lingered after every conversation, every laugh, every silence. Nobody said it out loud, but they all knew. The killing of Billy Batts hadn't ended that night in the dirt. It had just started something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Jimmy had always been good at compartmentalizing. That was his gift, his curse maybe. He could bury anything, a body, a lie, a memory. He could stand over a grave and never flinch, pour another drink, and keep going. But after Tommy vanished, there was a change in him, subtle but real. He didn't laugh as much. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, started to look tired around the edges. The way he smoked changed too. Longer pauses between drags, slower exhales, like each breath carried something he couldn't quite let go of. People said he was colder, but the truth was worse. He wasn't colder. He was emptying out. Henry noticed it before anyone else. He'd always looked up to Jimmy, even feared him a little. There was something almost fatherly about the way Jimmy carried himself. A man who always had an answer, who always stayed calm no matter what. But now, when Henry walked into Robert's lounge, Jimmy wasn't at his usual corner table. He was at the bar, alone, staring into his glass like it was the only thing left that made sense. The jukebox still played, the regulars still laughed, but Jimmy wasn't listening. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark, where the ghosts of the past talked louder than any living man. Henry sat beside him one night, both of them staring straight ahead. "You hear anything?" Henry asked quietly. Jimmy shook his head. "About what?" "Tommy." There was a pause. Jimmy didn't look at him. "He's gone," he said simply. "Forget about him." But Henry couldn't. None of them could. Tommy's disappearance wasn't justice. It was a message. Everyone in their world knew it. The Gambinos had balanced the scales. The killing of a made man couldn't go unanswered, and Tommy, the kid who'd laughed too loud and hit too hard, had paid for it in silence. They didn't need to say it out loud. In the Mafia, silence said everything. Still, Jimmy couldn't let it go completely. He brought Tommy up in the life, trusted him, used him. And now he was gone because of one bad decision, one night that spiraled too far. It wasn't guilt that haunted Jimmy. Men like him didn't believe in guilt. It was the loss of control. The one thing he'd built his reputation on, the one thing that had kept him alive all these years, had slipped through his fingers. And now, even though no one dared accuse him of anything, he could feel the invisible eyes on him, watching, waiting. Henry tried to push forward. He threw himself into work, hijacks, credit scams, anything that brought in cash and kept him distracted. The Lufthansa heist was on the horizon, a score big enough to change everything. But no matter how much money they made, no matter how many nights they celebrated, that lingering sense of doom hung around like smoke that wouldn't clear. Every time he and Jimmy met, the conversation was shorter, the pauses longer. They'd exchange small talk about money, business, but never about the thing that tied them together. The night they killed Billy Batts. One night, years later, it came back to Henry in a dream. He saw Billy again, standing in the doorway of Robert's lounge, his suit clean, his smile calm, that same quiet confidence he'd always carried. But this time, there was no music, no laughter, just the sound of dirt falling, one scoop at a time. In the dream, Henry tried to look away, but he couldn't. Billy just stared at him, his eyes clear, unblinking. Then he spoke, his voice quiet and certain. "You can't bury what you still carry." Henry woke up drenched in sweat. He didn't tell anyone about the dream, but after that, he stopped going to the bar for a while. The years rolled on. The world changed. The streets that once belonged to wise guys started filling with junkies and kids who didn't know the names that used to make grown men shake. The suits disappeared, the codes faded, and the new generation didn't care about respect or silence. They cared about flash. But the old-timers still remembered. And every once in a while, someone would bring up Billy Batts. Not out loud, not directly, just in whispers like invoking a ghost. "Remember Batts?" Someone would murmur over a drink. "Yeah," the other would answer. "That one never sat right." And then they'd fall quiet again. Jimmy tried to act like it didn't matter. But he knew the truth. The death of Billy Batts had cursed him. Not in some mystical way, but in the way that every action in their world always found its way back around. You didn't get away with things in that life. You just bought time. And time was running out. When the Lufthansa heist went down in December of '78, Jimmy saw it as his redemption, the score that would put him back on top. Millions in cash, no blood spilled, at least not during the job. But in the days that followed, as the news spread and the money started disappearing, Jimmy began cleaning house. Paranoia took over. One by one, the men who'd helped with the job vanished. They found some in cars, others in dumpsters, others never at all. Jimmy didn't flinch. If the Batts murder had taught him anything, it was that loose ends got people killed. So he made sure there were no loose ends. Henry saw it happening and felt that same old fear creeping back. The same fear he'd felt the night they buried Billy. That mix of awe and dread that came from watching a man so calm about destruction. Jimmy didn't yell, didn't rage. He just made decisions. Cold, calculated, absolute. And once again, Henry found himself wondering how long before he became another problem to solve. The past never went away. It was always there, sitting quietly behind every success, every drink, every joke. It lived in the spaces between words, in the pauses that stretched too long. And even though they'd all stopped saying Billy's name, he was still with them, in the shadows, in their dreams, in the quiet moments when the noise of the world faded and the truth came crawling back. Years later, when Henry finally turned informant, when he sat in a sterile room and told the FBI everything, they asked him about that night. He hesitated. Out of all the crimes he'd been part of, all the scams, all the murders he'd witnessed, this was the one that still made his stomach twist. He told them the story like it was something that happened to someone else, a movie he'd watched too many times. He talked about the party, the beating, the car ride, the burial. He said it all like a man describing whether he couldn't control. But at the end, when the agent asked him why kill a made man over a joke, Henry didn't have an answer. He just stared down at his hands and said quietly, "Because in that life, you don't get to think about why. You just do it." When the story hit the news years later, when the world outside finally learned about the murder of Billy Batts, it became something else. Myth, legend, entertainment. Reporters wrote about it. Filmmakers recreated it. People whispered about it like it was folklore. But for the men who had lived it, there was nothing romantic about it. There was no glory, no loyalty, no code. Just a body in a trunk, a hole in the ground, and a silence that never really ended. Jimmy grew old with that silence. By the time he was in prison, the world he'd helped build was gone. The names that once carried power meant nothing now. He'd sit in his cell at night, the walls closing in, the hum of the fluorescent light overhead the only sound. Some nights, he'd think about Tommy, the kid who laughed too loud, who thought he was untouchable. Other nights, he'd think about Billy, the man who smiled too easily, who didn't know when to stop talking. But most nights, he thought about the silence that came after both of them, the stillness that followed every scream, every shovel of dirt, every glass of whiskey poured for ghosts. He never talked about it. Not to the guards, not to the other inmates, not even to the priests who came by offering salvation. What was there to say? Words couldn't undo it. Confession didn't clean the blood off your hands in that life. You just carried it until you couldn't anymore. Henry lived longer than anyone expected. He outlasted the world he came from, outlasted the codes, the fear, the fame. But even in witness protection, even under new names and new addresses, he couldn't escape the weight of it. He said once, in an interview, that the thing that haunted him most wasn't the violence itself. It was the quiet afterward. The silence in the car. The silence in the field. The silence in Jimmy's voice when he said, "He's gone." That silence, he said, followed him everywhere. It was like carrying an echo that never fades. The story of Billy Batts wasn't just a murder. It was a mirror held up to the soul of the Mafia, a reminder that in that world, loyalty was just another word men used before they buried each other. Billy believed in the old ways, the rules that once gave men like him a kind of dark dignity. But the men who killed him belonged to a new generation, a generation that no longer feared consequences. And in that small space between tradition and chaos, between respect and rage, everything the Mafia once stood for began to die. Somewhere in Connecticut, the ground still holds what's left of him. The trees have grown thicker, the roads have changed, but the dirt remembers. It always does. And maybe that's the only justice left. Not the kind handed down by men in suits or judges in courtrooms, but the quiet justice of the earth itself, which never forgets what's been given to it. Jimmy Burke died in prison. Henry Hill died an old man under a fake name. Tommy DeSimone never made it to 30. And Billy Batts, William Bentvena, stayed exactly where they left him. But his story never stayed buried. It lingered in the cracks of history, in the corners of bars where old men still talk about the way things used to be. His name became a warning, a ghost story whispered in the same breath as all the others who believed the rules would protect them. In the end, the Mafia didn't kill Billy Batts. Pride did. Pride, ego, and the illusion of power that made men think they were gods until the dirt reminded them otherwise. And when the last of them were gone, when the noise had finally faded and the city they once ruled had forgotten their faces, all that was left was silence. The same silence that had followed them from that bar in Queens to that field in Connecticut. The kind of silence that swallows everything. The kind that outlasts even the dead. Chapter 13. The Ghost in the Ground. By the time the 80s rolled in, the story of Billy Batts had already faded into rumor. One of those tales that lived in the cracks of the underworld, half truth and half warning, told only when the whiskey was deep and the lights were low. His name wasn't spoken much anymore, not because people forgot, but because they remembered too well. The old-timers knew what had happened to him, and they also knew what it had cost. For the men who'd buried him, the world had moved on, but their ghosts hadn't. The earth might have taken Billy's body, but it never really kept him. He was still there, lingering like the smell of gunpowder after a shot, a ghost that never stopped watching the men who thought they'd escaped him. Jimmy Burke had learned to live with silence. By then, he was older, heavier, slower, but no less dangerous. He'd lost most of his hair, his suits didn't fit quite as sharp, and his smile came less often. But his mind was still sharp as glass. The Lufthansa heist had made him rich beyond measure, but it had also tightened the circle around him until he could barely breathe. Everyone who'd helped him on that job was gone now. Some were found in trunks, others vanished completely, their names spoken only in whispers. The same pattern that had started with Billy Bats was repeating itself again: betrayal, paranoia, and blood. Every night, Jimmy sat alone at the bar he once ruled, nursing a drink that he never really drank. The laughter around him had changed. The faces were new, younger, cockier. They didn't know the history of that place, didn't understand that the floorboards they stood on had once been soaked in the blood of a made man. To them, Jimmy was just another old-timer with stories about the good old days. They didn't realize those stories were built on graves. Sometimes, when he caught them laughing too loud, he'd smile, not because he found it funny, but because he knew how it ended. Every young gangster thinks he's untouchable. Every one of them ends up in the same dirt. Henry Hill saw it too. He was still in Jimmy's orbit back then, though the distance between them was growing. Henry had changed. The paranoia that once lived in his bones was now visible on his face. The drugs didn't help. Cocaine had become his new religion, his comfort, his punishment, his escape. He'd wake up sweating in the middle of the night, convinced someone was outside his house. He'd check the blinds, the locks, the car. Every noise was a warning. Every silence a setup. But the truth was simpler than that. There was no one outside. The danger wasn't coming for him. It was already inside him. Jimmy watched Henry spiral and didn't say a word. He'd always believed that men like Henry either burned out or sold out. There was no middle ground. Too jumpy, he told a friend once. He's got that look in his eyes, the look of a man who talks before he thinks. And Jimmy was right. It was only a matter of time before Henry's nerves snapped completely. But even as their lives unraveled, the shadow of Billy Bats remained. It wasn't just the murder itself. It was what it represented. That night in Robert's lounge had been the beginning of the end, not just for Billy, but for the code that once defined the Mafia. Killing a made man without permission was the kind of act that should have destroyed everyone involved immediately. But somehow, they'd gotten away with it. Or at least, they thought they had. There were still men in the Gambino family who remembered. They remembered Billy's loyalty, his silence, his years behind bars. They remembered that he came home and never got to enjoy a single day of it. And they remembered who was there that night. Jimmy Burke was Irish, which made him untouchable in some ways, but not invincible. He wasn't one of them. He never could be. The Luccheses tolerated him because he made money. But the Gambinos? They were patient, and patience in that world was just another word for revenge deferred. Years passed. Henry turned rat. The FBI came knocking, and for the first time in his life, Henry Hill couldn't talk fast enough. He gave them names, stories, entire histories. He talked about the heists, the scams, the murders. And then, finally, he talked about Billy Bats. When he said the name out loud, it was like exhaling poison that had been trapped inside him for a decade. The agents leaned in, taking notes, their faces pale as he described every detail: the bar, the beating, the trunk, the burial. "We hit him hard," Henry said quietly. "He was still breathing when we put him in the trunk. I can still hear it, the sound of him trying to breathe." One of the agents asked him why. Why kill a man like Bats over a joke? Henry stared at the table for a long time before answering. Because in that life, he said, nobody knows where the line is until they cross it. The story of Billy's murder made headlines after that. It became one of those legendary Mafia tales that reporters love to tell, the kind that turned monsters into myth. But the truth behind it was uglier, smaller, more human. It wasn't about business or loyalty or power. It was about ego, about a young man who couldn't handle being reminded of the boy he used to be, about an old man who didn't know when to stop talking. It was about pride, that simple and deadly thing that drove every man in that world to his grave. When the newspapers wrote about it, they used words like brutal and senseless. But they didn't understand the silence that came after, the kind that doesn't fade when the body's gone. For Jimmy, that silence became his second skin. He carried it with him everywhere. In his dreams, he'd still see the dirt, still feel the weight of the shovel. He never talked about it, not once. But every man who looked him in the eye could see it there, behind that calm stare, the knowledge that one day the earth would take him too. Henry, meanwhile, tried to outrun it. He went into witness protection, changed his name, changed his face, changed his story. But you can't change what you've done. Not really. He tried to build a new life, to live like an ordinary man. But ordinary men don't wake up every morning remembering the sound of a trunk closing. He'd sit at diners, chain-smoking, staring out the window at strangers, and wonder if they knew, if they could feel it on him. The stain, he said once, in an interview years later, that night followed me everywhere. I still hear him sometimes. I'll be driving, and I'll swear I hear knocking from the trunk. For the rest of his life, that ghost stayed with him. Maybe it wasn't Billy himself. Maybe it was just what Billy represented. The moment Henry realized there was no going back. That every laugh, every dollar, every handshake after that night was borrowed time. The ground in Connecticut still held its secret. Over the years, people speculated. They searched, they dug, they theorized. Some claimed they found bones. Others said the site was paved over, swallowed by time. No one ever knew for sure. But the story kept breathing, passed down like a whispered confession. Every generation of gangsters heard it and understood what it meant. The rules weren't broken that night. They were buried with Billy Bats. In prison, Jimmy heard about Henry turning informant. The news didn't surprise him. He was always going to talk, Jimmy told another inmate. Guys like him always do. But beneath that bitterness was something deeper, something like betrayal. He had trusted Henry, let him close, share the kind of silence you can only share with someone whose buried body's beside you. And now, Henry was out there, telling the world their secrets, telling the world about Billy. When Jimmy died behind bars years later, there was no ceremony, no crowd, just another old gangster whose time had run out. But somewhere in that quiet space between life and death, maybe he finally met the ghost he'd been avoiding. Maybe Billy was waiting, smiling that same calm smile he'd worn the night it all went wrong. Maybe the silence finally broke. For Henry, the years that followed were slow unraveling. Fame didn't bring peace. He became a character in his own story, a man defined by the crimes he once tried to forget. The movies, the books, the interviews, they turned his past into entertainment, but the truth underneath never changed. Every time someone asked him about Billy Bats, he'd smile awkwardly, crack a joke, deflect. But when the camera stopped rolling, his hands would tremble, just a little, because deep down, he knew that no matter how many names he changed, how many stories he told, the ghost was still there. The dirt was still on his hands. The story of Billy Bats wasn't just about one man's death. It was about the slow death of an entire code. Once, the Mafia had rules, rituals, a kind of dark honor that separated it from the chaos it thrived in. But by the 70s, those rules were rotting. The young men didn't care about respect. They cared about reputation. And in that world, reputation came from fear, not loyalty. The killing of Billy Bats was proof that the code no longer mattered. When Tommy's fists fell that night, they didn't just kill a man. They killed the illusion that the Mafia still stood for something beyond greed and ego. Even now, decades later, his story lingers like a curse. In every city where men whisper about the life, there's a lesson buried inside it. About pride, about silence, about the way one careless word can turn a barroom joke into a death sentence. And maybe that's why Billy Bats never really left. Because he wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of what happens when the rules of the underworld collide with the chaos of the streets. His ghost doesn't haunt through fear, it haunts through truth. Through the realization that in that world, there are no happy endings, no quiet retirements, no loyalty that lasts. There's only the dirt, the silence, and the waiting. Somewhere in that Connecticut field, maybe the trees have grown taller. Maybe the road has changed. Maybe houses stand where there was once only fog and mud. But if you walk there at night, if the air is still and the wind is right, you can almost hear it. The faint sound of shovels, the murmur of men trying not to speak, and the whisper of a name carried on the cold air. A reminder that the past never stays buried. It just waits for someone to dig it up again. Billy Batts was gone, but the story of his death lived on. Not because it was famous, but because it was inevitable. In that life, everyone ends up in the ground eventually. Some just get there sooner. And as the last of the old-timers faded away, as the cities changed and the codes dissolved, one truth remained the same. You can bury a man, you can silence his name, but the earth always remembers what it's been asked to hold. And in that quiet Connecticut soil, where the fog still clings to the trees, the ghost of Billy Batts is still there, waiting, watching, whispering through the years to every man who thinks he's bigger than the life he chose, reminding them, as only the dead can, that the ground always gets the last word. Chapter 14. The Legend of the Quiet Man. By the time the 90s came, Billy Batts had become a story told in half-light. You'd hear his name in dim bars, in whispered conversations between old men who had seen too much and said too little. The younger guys barely knew who he was. To them, he was just another casualty from a world that didn't exist anymore, a name buried under decades of dirt and silence. But to those who'd been there, who'd known him, the name still carried a strange power, a chill that crept into a room whenever it was spoken. Billy Batts wasn't just a man who got killed. He was the reminder that even legends could be erased with a single mistake. William Billy Batts, Bentvena had been born into that life long before he ever swore the oath. He came up in Brooklyn's Little Italy, when the rules were clear, when a man's word was everything. To people who knew him, he wasn't a loud man. He didn't have to be. He had a smile that disarmed you, a way of talking that made you feel like he saw more than he said. They used to call him the Quiet Man, not because he was shy, but because he didn't waste words. And when he did speak, people listened. By the time he was in his 30s, he had earned his button, a made man in the Gambino family. That was the crown jewel of that world. It meant you'd earned respect, protection, and power. It meant that your life belonged to the family, but in return, the family would protect you until your last breath. It meant you were untouchable. And for years, Billy carried that with the kind of pride only old-school men could. He lived by the code, believed in it like a religion. Loyalty, respect, silence, those were his commandments. But the world around him was changing. The new generation of gangsters wasn't built the same. They didn't come up through hardship or loyalty. They came up through quick scores and faster tempers. They didn't wait their turn. They took what they wanted. The Mafia that Billy had joined was vanishing before his eyes, replaced by something meaner, louder, and far less disciplined. And the night he walked into Robert's lounge to celebrate his homecoming from prison, he walked straight into the heart of that change. Years later, when people told the story, they always talked about the irony. How a man nicknamed the Quiet Man was killed because he talked too much. But that wasn't the truth. Billy didn't die because of what he said. He died because of what he represented. He was a living reminder of an older code in a world that had forgotten how to follow it. Men like Tommy DeSimone couldn't stand that kind of man, the kind who didn't need to prove himself, who didn't need to shout to be feared. Tommy was from a new breed, wild, unstable, born out of chaos. His version of power came from fear, not respect. He'd grown up hearing stories about men like Billy, but never learned the part about restraint. He'd spent his life clawing for recognition in a world that would never let him in fully, not with his bloodline. So when Billy teased him that night, just a harmless joke between men who'd known each other years before prison, it cut deeper than anyone realized. Tommy didn't hear the joke. He heard humiliation. That's the tragedy of it all. Billy never meant it as disrespect. He was smiling when he said it, like an old friend ribbing a younger one. But in Tommy's head, it became a declaration of war. A made man was supposed to be untouchable, but Tommy wasn't thinking about the rules. He was thinking about pride, about image, about proving something to himself. That night, when his fists came down, they didn't just shatter Billy's jaw. They shattered the illusion that the Mafia still had honor. And after that, nothing was the same. The people who lived through those years never talked about Billy's death like it was just another hit. It wasn't business. It wasn't sanctioned. It was chaos wearing the face of power. It was the night that silence, the sacred, unspoken bond of their world, turned into something darker. The kind of silence that comes not from respect, but from fear. The kind that eats at your conscience in the middle of the night. For Henry Hill, it became the ghost that followed him everywhere. Even in witness protection, when he was living under a different name in some quiet suburb, he couldn't escape it. He said once, in an interview long after, that sometimes when the world got too quiet, he could still hear the dull thump of the shovel. He could still see the fog rising from the Connecticut ground. He said he didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in consequences. And in that world, he said, every sin comes back wearing a new name. For Jimmy Burke, the silence turned into paranoia. He'd sit at bars in the middle of the day, nursing a drink he never finished, eyes darting toward the door. He didn't talk much anymore, and when he did, it was never about the past. But everyone who knew him could see that something had shifted in him after that night. The man who'd once planned every move with surgical precision had become restless. The walls were closing in, and somewhere deep down, he knew why. The earth remembers. It always does. People think that when you bury someone, the ground keeps your secret. But the truth is, the ground has a voice of its own. You can muffle it for a while, but eventually, it speaks. And when it doesn't whisper, it roars. Decades later, when the FBI started unearthing old stories from old crew members, the ghost of Billy Batts came crawling back. His name appeared in courtrooms, in testimony, in films that turned real blood into entertainment. It was strange. The man who had lived his life in silence became immortal through noise. His death became part of cinematic history, reenacted for audiences who would never know his real face, who would never hear his real laugh. To them, he was just a character in a movie. But to the men who had known him, it was a wound that never healed. Even Jimmy, in his last years behind bars, couldn't escape it. Other inmates would bring it up sometimes, carelessly, jokingly. They'd mention the movie, the story, the legend. Jimmy would just stare at them, unblinking. And sometimes, very quietly, he'd say, "That ain't how it happened." But he never said how it did. He never corrected the details, never set the record straight. Because deep down, he knew that truth didn't matter anymore. The legend was stronger. The truth is, Billy Batts wasn't just killed that night. He was erased. His name became shorthand for a moment in time when the old Mafia died and the new one, louder, bloodier, and dumber, took its place. He was the dividing line between respect and recklessness, between the quiet and the chaos. And that's what makes his story so haunting. Because it's not just about one man's death. It's about the death of an entire way of life. There's an old saying in that world. The past doesn't stay buried. It waits. And for the men who lived through it, that proved true. One by one, they all paid the price. Tommy was erased by the same hands that had once protected him. Jimmy died in a cell, staring at walls that didn't listen. Henry lived long enough to see his own story turn into a myth he barely recognized. And through it all, the ghost of Billy Batts lingered quietly, patient as ever, reminding them that the ground never forgets. Sometimes, people go to the spot in Connecticut where they say he's buried. It's quiet there, too quiet. The road nearby has changed. The trees are taller. The soil has been turned over by time and weather. But there's something about that place that makes people lower their voices without even realizing it. Like the air itself is listening. Some say if you go there at night, when the fog rolls in thick and the world goes still, you can hear it, the faint sound of laughter, the echo of voices from another lifetime. The past, whispering through the roots. And maybe that's what haunts people most about Billy's story. It isn't the violence. It isn't even the betrayal. It's the silence that followed. The sense that something pure, something that once had meaning, was lost that night and never found again. The Mafia always prided itself on being timeless, on surviving presidents, wars, and generations of cops who try to tear it down. But in reality, it was never the law that killed the Mafia. It was men like Tommy DeSimone, men who forgot the rules, men who mistook fear for respect, men who thought the old ways were just stories told by relics like Billy Bats. But Billy wasn't a relic. He was the last of a dying breed, a man who truly believed that silence was power, that respect was currency, that loyalty was sacred. His kind was disappearing long before the night he died, but with him went the last breath of that world's honor. After Billy, everything changed. The lines blurred, the codes crumbled, and the streets stopped whispering about respect. They started screaming about money. If you ask the old-timers about Billy now, they'll tell you he had a smile that made people drop their guard, a calm that hit a spine of steel. They'll tell you that he never raised his voice, never broke his word, and never believed he could be killed by one of his own. They'll tell you he was too trusting, too loyal, too blind to see how the rules had changed. And then, if you watch closely, they'll go quiet. Their eyes will drift somewhere far away, to a bar that doesn't exist anymore, to a night that still echoes through time. The story of Billy Bats has been told and retold, polished and twisted, but the real story doesn't live in the movies or the books. It lives in that moment when the world shifts, the second before the first punch lands, the heartbeat before the silence swallows everything. That's where Billy still lives, suspended in the space between laughter and death, between the old world and the new. The legend of the quiet man isn't about revenge or glory. It's about the cost of forgetting where you came from. It's about what happens when men who once swore to protect each other start believing their own lies. It's about how easily respect turns into pride, and how quickly pride turns into a grave. Maybe that's why the story still lingers, decades later, because it's not just about the Mafia. It's about all of us, about the fragile line between honor and ego, between control and chaos. Billy's death was the night that line snapped, and the men who broke it spent the rest of their lives pretending they hadn't heard it. Now, all that's left is a silence, the kind that stretches across generations, the kind that turns truth into myth and myth into warning. Somewhere out there, the ghost of Billy Bats is still smiling that same quiet smile, the one that hides everything and says nothing, waiting for the next man who thinks the rules don't apply to him, waiting for history to repeat itself, as it always does. Because in the end, no matter how far time carries the story, one truth remains unchanged. The ground still remembers, the silence still speaks, and the quiet man never really stopped watching. Chapter 15. The Silence That Never Ends. There's a strange kind of stillness that hangs over the end of every story like this. When the guns are silent, when the names fade from headlines, and when the men who once terrified the streets are reduced to myths. The world moved on from Billy Bats, from Jimmy Burke, from Henry Hill, from the endless cycle of blood and silence that defined them. But the truth is, stories like these never really end. They just go quiet for a while, like embers buried under ash, waiting for someone to stir them again. Billy's name had become part of that silence, a whisper, a warning, a ghostly presence that refused to leave the world that buried him. He wasn't just another casualty in the Mafia's long history of betrayal. He was something more, a symbol of how fragile power really is, and how quickly it disappears when loyalty becomes a currency men spend too easily. When Henry Hill told his story to the FBI, to writers, to filmmakers, it wasn't just the details that caught people's attention. It was the guilt buried beneath his words, the way his voice softened every time he said Billy's name, the hesitation that slipped through his calm, rehearsed tone. He wanted to believe he was telling his story for survival, for truth, maybe even for redemption. But deep down, he knew the truth. You can't confess away a ghost. Every word he spoke made Billy more alive, not less. Every interview, every headline, every retelling was another resurrection of the man they thought they'd erased forever. Jimmy Burke's silence was different. He carried his ghost in his chest like stones, heavy but familiar. He didn't talk. Didn't explain, didn't justify. He just kept living the way he always had, methodical, detached, as if time itself couldn't touch him. But as the years passed, that silence began to weigh on him too. When he walked through the prison yard, the younger inmates would look at him with a mix of awe and fear. They knew the stories. They'd heard about the Lufthansa heist, about the bodies that followed, about the man who could smile while the world burned around him. But none of them understood that behind that calm stare was something hollow. Jimmy didn't fear death. He feared the remembering. The quiet moments in the dark when every sound faded and all that was left was the echo of the past. The shovel in the dirt, the muffled sound of life leaving a body, the laughter that died too soon. Tommy DeSimone never got that far. His story ended the same way it began, with chaos. His death was supposed to balance the scales, but in that world, nothing ever balanced for long. His name became another ghost story, told in bars and prison cells, a cautionary tale about the man who thought he could rewrite the rules. But his absence didn't erase the consequences. If anything, it deepened them. Tommy's disappearance didn't bury the sin. It multiplied it, because every man who survived him, Jimmy, Henry, even the bosses who gave the orders, knew that the killing of Billy Batts had cursed them all. They used to say that the Mafia's greatest weapon wasn't violence. It was silence. Omerta, the code of silence, wasn't just a rule. It was a belief system. It was the idea that what happens in the life stays in the life. That silence was strength. But over time, that silence turned into something else. It became rot. It started to eat them from the inside out. Because silence might protect you from the cops, but it doesn't protect you from your own conscience. You can bury a body, but you can't bury what it did to your soul. That's the thing no one ever understood about that world. The violence ends fast, but the silence lasts forever. When Henry went into witness protection, he tried to build something new. A house in the suburbs. A quiet life. A new name. A new face. But the silence followed him there too. The sound of sprinklers and birds in the morning didn't drown out the memories. He'd catch himself staring out the window at night, half expecting to see headlights coming down the street, half hoping they'd come for him. He said once that normal life was harder than the life he'd left behind. At least when you're in it, he said, you know who's after you. But it wasn't the feds or the mob that haunted him. It was Billy. The memory of that night never left him. The sound of laughter turning to screams. The thud of fists on flesh. The look on Jimmy's face. Focused, calm, almost detached. The way Tommy's voice broke through the noise. High and wild. Like a man enjoying the sound of his own madness. And then the silence after. The kind of silence that never really ends, no matter how many miles you drive or how many times you change your name. Henry tried to drink it away. He tried to snort it away. He tried to tell the story so many times that maybe one day it would stop feeling real. But it never worked. Every version, every retelling, only reminded him of the same truth. There are some things you don't come back from. Jimmy died alone in a cold cell, his body worn down by time and regret he would never admit. The guard said he barely spoke in his final years. He'd sit on his bunk, staring at the wall, the faint hum of the prison lights filling the air around him. Sometimes late at night, he'd whisper things, names, places, maybe prayers. No one ever caught all of it, but one guard swore he heard him say he should have stayed quiet. Whether he meant Billy or himself, no one could tell. And Billy Batts? His story stayed in the ground. For decades, people searched for his body. Reporters chased rumors. Cops followed tips. And old mobsters hinted at knowing the spot. But the truth is, the earth doesn't give back what it's been asked to keep. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of time and soil, Billy still sleeps in silence. But his legend never rested. The streets kept his name alive, the stories kept him breathing, and the guilt of those who killed him made sure he never truly disappeared. In a way, he won, because long after his killers were gone, his name still haunted the living. Every new generation of gangsters learned about him. Every story of the old days eventually circled back to that night at Robert's Lounge. The night when the code broke, when friendship turned to blood, when laughter turned to death. The night that showed what the Mafia had really become, a machine that devoured its own. In that world, the rules had always been simple, loyalty above all. But Billy's death showed what happens when that rule becomes just another lie. It wasn't loyalty that killed him. It was ego, pride, fear, the same things that always kill men like them in the end. When Scorsese's Goodfellas hit theaters, the world finally saw the story from the inside, or at least a version of it. People laughed, they gasped, they admired the swagger, the style, the madness. But for the men who had lived it, it wasn't entertainment. It was memory. It was the past clawing its way back into the light. Henry once said that watching that movie felt like being haunted by his own reflection, seeing the worst night of his life immortalized, turn into art, into legend. He said it made him feel small, like a footnote in someone else's story. But that's what they all became in the end, footnotes. Jimmy, Tommy, Henry. Men who once ruled the streets reduced to names in books, lines in movies, whispers in bars. And Billy Bats, the man they thought they'd erased, outlived them all, not in body, but in legend. Sometimes, when you look at the history of the Mafia, you can trace the exact moment when everything changed. The night Billy Bats died was one of those moments. It was the point where the old code cracked and the new one took over, where fear replaced respect, where silence stopped being sacred and started being the only thing left. If you strip away the glamour, the suits, the nicknames, the codes, what you're left with is this: men afraid of being forgotten, trying to make their mark in a world that never cared about them. And Billy Bats became the symbol of that. The reminder that no matter how powerful you think you are, there's always someone younger, hungrier, and dumber waiting to take your place. But the irony, the cruel twist, is that Billy never wanted to be a legend. He just wanted to come home, to have a drink, laugh with old friends, and live the rest of his life in peace. He'd done his time. He'd paid his dues. He believed in the system that had raised him, and it betrayed him. That's the real tragedy. Not the violence, not the betrayal, but the trust. The simple, human trust of a man who thought he was safe among his own. Now, when people talk about him, they talk about the movie, the beating, the burial. But they forget the man, the quiet confidence, the charm, the discipline, the way he believed in silence as a form of strength, the way he carried himself like someone who had nothing left to prove. The world only remembers how he died, not how he lived. But if you look closely at the stories, between the lines, behind the myths, you can still catch glimpses of him. The man behind the legend. The quiet man who smiled too easily, who trusted too deeply, and who died because he believed the code still meant something. The silence that followed his death never really ended. It stretched across decades, into prisons, into courtrooms, into the kind of memories that never fade. It swallowed the men who caused it and everyone who tried to forget it. Because in the end, silence isn't peace. It's punishment. It's the sound that reminds you of everything you've buried and everything you can't escape. And somewhere, beneath the earth that holds his bones, that silence still breathes. Not angry, not vengeful, just patient, waiting for the next man who thinks he can outrun the past, waiting for the next fool who believes he's untouchable. Because the truth, the one the wise guys never want to admit, is that in their world, nobody stays untouchable forever. The names change, the streets change, the rules change, but the silence remains. It's the one thing that never dies. It's the echo of every promise broken, every rule betrayed, every life taken too soon. It's the heartbeat of that world, the only thing left when the laughter stops, when the power fades, when the legends fall. So maybe that's how it ends, not with gunfire or glory, but with quiet, with the sound of wind through the trees above an unmarked grave, with the faint memory of a smile, with the ghost of a man who should have stayed quiet, but whose silence outlived them all. And as the years turn, as the city changes and the last of the old guard disappears, the story of Billy Bats remains, not as a warning, not even as a tragedy, but as a truth whispered in the dark, passed from one generation of outlaws to the next. The silence never ends. It waits, just like the ground, and it never, ever forgets.